What if royalty wasn't just crowns and castles but quirky obsessions, flaming scarves, and Tupperware full of cereal? Behind the golden gates and velvet curtains, the British monarchy is stranger, funnier, and far more human than you ever imagined. From pet turtles in palaces to handwritten notes for cows, these are the bizarre habits and hidden quirks they never teach in history class. This isn't just royalty, it's weird royalty. Welcome to 101 Weirdest Facts About British Monarchs. You'll never look at the royal family the same way again. Before we dive into the madness of royal quirks, make sure to hit that subscribe button. This rabbit hole goes deep. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you uncover these royal oddities? Queen Elizabeth II had a button hidden under her dining table. When Queen Elizabeth II was done eating at a formal event, she didn't need to say a word or lift a finger. Hidden beneath her dining table was a discreet button she could press to signal to her staff that the meal was over. Once the Queen stopped eating, everyone else had to stop too. The button was a silent command, ending conversation and courses in one subtle move. It was an invisible form of power, more effective than any bell or spoken word. Guests often never realized what had happened until their plates were whisked away mid-bite. This secret mechanism revealed just how seamlessly protocol and personal comfort blended in the royal household. And it wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was a quiet assertion of dominance wrapped in silver service. But while the Queen had her hidden buttons, her son would bring something even more bizarre to royal life. King Charles III travels with his own toilet seat. King Charles III is not a man who leaves comfort to chance. Whenever he travels, whether it's a royal tour or a private retreat, his entourage ensures his personal toilet seat is packed and ready. According to former staff, this isn't just a quirky preference, it's a requirement. The seat is supposedly padded, perfectly contoured, and always sanitized to his standards. And that's not the only bathroom eccentricity. Charles also insists that his toilet paper be folded into precise triangles, hotel style, no matter where he goes. From palaces to remote villages, staff must prepare his accommodations with the same meticulous detail. Some might call it pampered, others call it consistency. Either way, it's not a trait you'd expect from a king once portrayed as forward-thinking. But before Charles ever brought his own loo, one royal had everyone questioning reincarnation. Prince Philip once joked he was reincarnated from an Indian goddess. Prince Philip was no stranger to strange remarks, but one of his most confounding comments came during a visit to India. With his famously deadpan humor, he joked to a journalist that he believed he'd been reincarnated from an Indian goddess. The journalist, unsure if it was satire or mysticism, spent weeks trying to verify the claim. While many dismissed it as another one of Philip's off-color gags, the remark took on a life of its own, especially among followers of quirky royal trivia. For a man who once said, "If it has 4 legs and it's not a chair, I don't trust it," this reincarnation quip was par for the course. But beneath the humor lay a pattern. Philip often used absurdity to deflect deeper questions. Whether he truly believed in reincarnation is unknown, but his next quirk is just as strange and involves cushions and a royal refusal to sit down. Queen Mary of Teck refused to sit on used chairs. Queen Mary of Teck, grandmother to Queen Elizabeth II, had a peculiar obsession with cleanliness and personal space that bordered on the theatrical. She believed that chairs previously used by others were somehow tainted. At public events, private gatherings, or royal visits, she demanded freshly cushioned seating regardless of the location or inconvenience. Her staff had to scramble ahead of her schedule to ensure no chair she encountered had been used. If there was even a hint that someone had previously occupied the seat, it was replaced or reupholstered on the spot. This odd ritual wasn't just about germ-sit, stemmed from her deep sense of regal dignity. To sit where someone else had sat felt, to her, like a breach of royal purity. Even aristocrats who lent her furniture during visits often never got it back either because it was deemed unfit or because she simply decided to keep it. Her behavior laid the foundation for many of the eccentric royal traditions that followed, but no one saw what was coming next. A royal coronation stopped dead in its tracks not by scandal, but by something far more grotesque. Edward VII once postponed a coronation because of a burst boil. The grand coronation of Edward VII in 1902 was supposed to be a majestic continuation of monarchy. The crowds were ready, the abbey was prepared, and the crown itself stood gleaming on a velvet cushion. But just days before the ceremony, the new king developed a painful abdominal abscessentially, a giant boil on his backside. It became so severe that doctors feared it would kill him. In what was then considered a shocking and undignified twist, the coronation was postponed, and Edward underwent emergency surgery with chloroform as anesthesia. The press spun the story delicately, calling it a health issue. But behind palace doors it was seen as both humiliating and bizarre. Edward, known for his indulgent lifestyle and love of rich foods, had suffered a very human affliction known that interrupted the most sacred royal ritual. The event eventually went ahead weeks later, but the shadow of the incident lingered. His reign began not with fanfare, but with stitches and scandal. And yet, despite this, the monarchy endured, though his successor would bring with him a whole new brand of oddity, one involving a cuddly bear hidden away from public view. George VI was so nervous, he had a stress teddy bear he hid in his desk drawer. King George VI, often remembered for his quiet strength during World War II, carried a secret vulnerability throughout his reign-crippling anxiety. While public speeches left him trembling and stammering, few knew the lengths he went to soothe himself in private. Hidden in a desk drawer at Buckingham Palace was a small, well-worn teddy bear. It wasn't a gift from a child or a ceremonial keepsake, it was his personal comfort object. When overwhelmed, George would open the drawer, hold the bear briefly, and then return to business. His staff noticed, but never spoke of it, understanding it was part of his coping ritual. The bear, anonymous and unadorned, became a silent partner in royal decision-making. In an age when mental health was barely discussed, George VI found refuge in childhood simplicity. And though history hails him as the steady wartime monarch, behind closed doors was a man constantly wrestling with self-doubt, clutching a soft toy as the world crumbled around him. His daughter would later adopt her own quiet coping tools, but none quite so symbolic as a stuffed bear. The next mystery? A nickname whispered behind palace walls, colder than protocol and sharper than jewels. Princess Diana, called Queen Elizabeth II, the boss, but privately referred to her as the Ice Cube. In public, Princess Diana maintained the utmost respect toward her mother-in-law, often calling Queen Elizabeth II the boss, with a polite smile and a nod to hierarchy. But behind closed doors, Diana had a very different nickname for the monarch, the Ice Cube. It wasn't meant lightly. To Diana, this moniker captured everything she felt was cold, distant, and emotionally rigid about life inside the palace. While the Queen prided herself on stoicism and control, Diana often found the royal atmosphere sterile and unfeeling, particularly during times of personal crisis. The nickname wasn't shared widely, only with a few close confidants, and reportedly scribbled in letters now kept under lock and key. It was her way of processing a world that, despite its opulence, often felt like a gilded prison. Diana's emotional openness was a jarring contrast to the palace's traditions of silence and duty, and though the Queen never openly acknowledged the nickname, those who knew both women recognized the generational and emotional rift it signified. But icy receptions were nothing new in the royal household, especially when one monarch decided that children had no place at the dinner table, not even her own. If you're enjoying this royal roller coaster so far, don't forget to subscribe for more strange and surprising history. And while we're between royal scandals, drop a comment and let us know, where are you watching from? And what time is it in your part of the world as you journey through these bizarre palace secrets? Queen Victoria didn't allow children to sit at dinner tables, even if they were royal. Queen Victoria, the towering matriarch of Britain's golden age, ran her household with military precision and little tolerance for childish behavior. One of her lesser-known but firmest rules was that children, including her own, were not allowed to dine with adults. Whether it was a formal banquet or a quiet family meal, the young royals were exiled to the nursery, far from the polished silver and starchy tablecloths of the royal dining room. To Victoria, children should be seen, trained, and seldom heard. Meals were serious affairs, and any whiff of whining, wiggling, or sloppy table manners was unacceptable. Even her beloved son Bertie, the future Edward VII, was routinely dismissed from meals, much to his lifelong resentment. This approach stemmed from Victoria's strict upbringing and obsession with discipline. Her letters and diaries show pride in maintaining a household where even her children addressed her as Your Majesty until they were well into their teens. It was a cold upbringing, softened only occasionally by brief glimpses of maternal affection. And while Victoria ruled with decorum, her beloved husband brought some strange levity into royal life, especially when it involved plumbing and peculiar animal sounds. Prince Albert loved installing mechanical gadgets, including a flush toilet that made duck noises. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort and the mind behind many of the palace's modernizations, had an unexpected fondness for mechanical innovation, particularly in the bathroom. He wasn't just a statesman and organizer of the Great Exhibition. Albert was a tinkerer at heart. One of his strangest inventions? A flush toilet that quacked like a duck. Whether he designed it for humor, as a private joke, or simply to startle guests is unknown. Installed in one of the lesser-used palace washrooms, the duck toilet reportedly startled more than one unsuspecting visitor with its waterfowl farewell. This wasn't a one-off. Albert had an entire wing of the palace outfitted with novel contraptions, self-warming footstools, mechanically rotating bookcases, and clocks with musical chimes he personally tuned. To him, the royal household wasn't just a place of ceremony, it was a laboratory of comfort and curiosity. But not all royals found solace in machines. His descendants would turn to much stranger habits, like communing with houseplants and insisting they talk back. King Charles III talks to his plants and says they respond to tone. Long before he became king, Charles was known as the green-fingered royal. But gardening was more than a hobby, it was, to him, a dialogue. He has openly admitted to talking to his plants, even giving them compliments and encouragement. While this was once mocked in tabloids as eccentric or borderline mad, Charles never wavered. He insisted that plants, like people, respond to tone and energy. He claimed his plants grew better when spoken to gently, and he'd sometimes scold them if they looked droopy. His garden at Highgrove became a living experiment, where roses, vegetables, and trees were nurtured not only by soil and sun but by royal conversation. Whether pseudoscience or personal ritual, it reflects his deep spiritual connection to nature. To Charles, the land was sacred, and everything on it, be it a daffodil or an oak, deserved kindness. This strange quirk, though now often quoted with affection, once earned him raised eyebrows among the political elite. But it wouldn't be the last time a royal would confuse taste with judgment, because one of Charles's younger relatives would soon show up to a party wearing something even plants would have wilted over. Prince Harry once wore a Nazi costume to a party, thinking it was just edgy. In one of the most explosive royal scandals of the 21st century, a young Prince Harry attended a costume party dressed as a Nazi soldier. The event was themed colonial and native, a tone-deaf premise to begin with, but Harry's choice of outfit, complete with swastika armband, crossed a line that stunned the world. The photograph, plastered across tabloids in 2005, sparked global outrage and forced the palace into damage control mode. Harry, then third in line to the throne, issued a public apology, claiming it was a poor decision made in ignorance. But the damage was done. Many saw it as a disturbing glimpse into the disconnect between the royal bubble and the real world. What's particularly strange is that Harry reportedly didn't see the problem at the time. He thought it was edgy, a private joke among friends. It wasn't until the backlash hit that the gravity of the situation sank in. The incident haunted him for years and was later discussed in interviews as a moment of painful immaturity. Ironically, just as Harry made headlines for his outfit, his grandmother was setting rules about something far less scandalous, but just as flavorful. Queen Elizabeth II banned garlic from Buckingham Palace kitchens for breath reasons. Of all the ingredients in the royal kitchens, none was more strictly forbidden than garlic. Queen Elizabeth II, despite her fondness for hearty British fare, insisted that no garlic be used in palace meals. The reason? Simply put, bad breath. As a monarch constantly engaged in up-close conversations with dignitaries, heads of state, and guests from around the globe, she believed that garlic breath was unbecoming of a queen. Royal chefs confirmed that dishes were often modified or reimagined entirely to avoid the offending bulb. Even family dinners followed the garlic ban, as her personal preferences quietly set the tone for the royal palate. This wasn't an official rule etched in palace policy, but it was one everyone knew to follow. Visiting chefs, foreign caterers, even private cooks on tour each had to double-check their recipes for compliance. Some might call it finicky, others practical, but it's undeniably one of the weirdest quirks of Elizabeth's reign. And while garlic was banished from the palace, one leaked phone call from her son would introduce a far stranger, far more uncomfortable phrase into the royal vocabulary. Prince Charles, now King Charles III, once admitted he wished he could be Camilas' tampon. Among the most eyebrow-raising moments in royal history is the infamous Tampon-gate scandal of 1993, a private phone conversation between then Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles that was leaked to the press. In the midst of romantic banter, Charles uttered the now legendary line, "I want to be reincarnated as a tampon." The British public was stunned. Newspapers splashed it across front pages, comedians had a field day, and Buckingham Palace faced an unprecedented PR disaster. It wasn't just the explicitness, it was the intimacy. Royals were meant to be aloof, mysterious, and restrained. Yet here was the heir to the throne speaking with cringe-worthy candor. What was intended as a private, affectionate moment revealed a side of Charles that the public had never seen and perhaps never wanted to. It humanized him, but in a way that caused discomfort. The moment has since become a kind of dark folklore in royal history, a reminder that even princes can embarrass themselves in ways that live on forever. Yet Charles wasn't the only monarch. With a peculiar obsession, his grandfather would pour his royal energy into something far more adhesive and significantly less awkward. King George V was obsessed with stamp collecting and built a multi-million-pound collection. King George V wasn't known for dramatic scandals or impassioned speeches. He was, in fact, one of Britain's quieter monarchs, but behind his stoic facade was a fierce obsession: postage stamps. George began collecting as a child, but his hobby escalated dramatically once he ascended the throne. He poured countless hours and an estimated £100,000 of his own money into amassing one of the world's finest stamp collections. This wasn't casual philately. George employed a full-time curator and arranged his stamps with museum-level precision. Visitors to Buckingham Palace were sometimes shown his prized albums, which he guarded more jealously than the crown jewels. One famous quote attributed to him, "I wish to God I had been a stamp dealer." His favorite acquisition? The rare Mauritius post office stamp, for which he paid a then record sum. While other kings ruled empires, George ruled over perforated corners and cancelled ink. His passion was so well known that foreign dignitaries would gift him rare stamps as diplomatic offerings. And yet, for all his formality, George had no problem with one of the most chaotic creatures ever to run through Buckingham Palace, the Corgi. Queen Elizabeth II had over 30 Corgis during her reign and referred to them as the family. Queen Elizabeth II's love for Corgis was legendary, borderline mythological. Over the course of her reign, she owned more than 30 of the stubby-legged canines, starting with Susan, a gift for her 18th birthday. These weren't just pets. They were companions, confidants, and travel partners. The Queen referred to them affectionately as the family, often giving them precedence over human visitors. They had their own room, their own gourmet meals prepared by palace chefs, and even their own Christmas stockings. At royal functions, they were allowed to roam freely, sometimes causing scenes by nipping at guests or barking at diplomats. Elizabeth found their antics endearing. Her corgis even traveled with her on private planes and royal trains, a privilege not extended to all staff. One anecdote describes the Queen canceling an event after learning one of her corgis was ill. Her bond with them was so deep that she reportedly refused to replace them after her last corgi died, saying she couldn't bear to leave any behind. These dogs, more than just beloved pets, represented a rare slice of freedom in a life dominated by duty. But the next royal took pampering a step further, feeding luxury to a four-legged friend, even in exile. Edward VIII fed his dog caviar while living in exile. After abdicating the throne in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, Edward VIII, the Duke of Windsor, never quite adjusted to life outside the royal bubble. Stripped of his crown but not his sense of entitlement, Edward surrounded himself with luxury, even in exile. One of his most bizarre indulgences was reserved not for himself, but for his beloved pug, Disraeli. The pampered pooch dined not on kibble or scraps, but on caviaries, the same delicacy reserved for royalty and billionaires. Even as Europe reeled from war and scarcity, Edward made sure his dog's dish was stocked with the finest fish roe money could buy. Staff members were ordered to serve the caviar at a precise temperature, and the dishware had to be sterling silver. The indulgence wasn't just about spoiling appetite, was a strange assertion of control in a life that had spiraled from throne to footnote. And while Edward lavished his canine companion, another royal would go to wild lengths for personal comfort, like literally hauling part of her bathroom across town. Princess Margaret once tried to bring a bathtub to a friend's home, insisting hers was too narrow. Princess Margaret, the Queen's younger sister, was known for her sharp tongue, high standards, and love of luxury. But one story stands out even among her many diva moments. The time she insisted on bringing her personal bathtub to a friend's estate because, in her words, theirs was too narrow. The request was so absurd that it left hosts and palace aides stunned. Margaret claimed she couldn't properly relax unless her bath met specific width and depth requirements. Anything less was an affront to her standards. In preparation for a multi-day visit, palace staff reportedly coordinated the logistics of moving the tub, though whether it actually arrived remains shrouded in rumor. What's certain is that Margaret never traveled light. She was known to bring her own linen, pillows, ashtrays, and even light bulbs when staying as a guest. Friends often joked that accommodating Margaret required a royal annex and a hydraulic lift. Her flair for the dramatic and insistence on personal standards made her both adored and exhausting. Yet for all her extravagance, her father George VI was known for something grittier, colder, and far more dangerous, a habit he couldn't break, not even in front of world leaders. George VI was a heavy chain smoker, even lighting cigarettes during state audiences. King George VI's public image was that of a reserved, dutiful monarch who led Britain through its darkest hours. But behind the curtain of wartime speeches and royal engagements, he fought a quieter, more personal war with nicotine. George VI was a relentless chain smoker, often lighting one cigarette off the end of the previous. His habit was so ingrained that he would smoke through meetings, letters, and even official state audiences. Diplomats would often find themselves talking policy while he puffed clouds into the air, sometimes barely acknowledging their discomfort. He reportedly kept multiple ashtrays in every room, and aides were tasked with ensuring he never went more than a few minutes without a fresh cigarette. His physicians warned him repeatedly, but like many of his generation, he dismissed the dangers. The stress of leadership and a naturally anxious temperament only fueled the addiction. Tragically, the years of heavy smoking contributed to the lung cancer that ultimately led to his early death. Yet while George clung to cigarettes, his queen consort was hiding something behind veils and Silencian insecurity that shaped her public image for decades. Queen Alexandra wore veils for decades. To hide facial scars she was self-conscious about. Queen Alexandra, the wife of Edward VII, was a paragon of elegance and grace in the public eye. Known for her fashion-forward style and composed demeanor, she became a beloved figure among the British people. But behind her shimmering tiaras and satin gowns lay a deeply rooted insecurity. For decades, Alexandra was rarely seen in public without a veil draped across her fascinate for mystique or fashion, but to conceal facial scars she believed marred her beauty. The exact cause of the scarring remains uncertain, though rumors swirled about a childhood illness or a botched cosmetic procedure. What mattered more was how it affected her sense of identity. At a time when women, particularly royals, were judged harshly by appearance, Alexandra went to great lengths to preserve an image of flawless beauty. The veils became her armor, a signature that both concealed and protected. Even in portraits and formal photographs, artists were instructed to flatter her features. To the world, she remained regal and untouchable. But her veils whispered a silent vulnerability. And while Alexandra masked her face, her son would go on to flaunt his floss-embracing scandal with a mistress list so extensive it needed an index. King Edward VII had a mistress list so long it was alphabetized. Edward VII, long before he wore the crown, built a reputation not for diplomacy or statesmanship, but for indulgence. Known as Bertie during his long wait as heir, Edward developed an insatiable appetite for food, fashion, and especially women. By the time he became king, he had already amassed a staggering list of mistresses, so many, in fact, that court insiders joked it had to be alphabetized. From actresses to aristocrats, his romantic escapades weren't hidden, they were paraded across Europe, often causing diplomatic waves. Among the most famous were Lily Langtry, Daisy Greville, and Alice Keppel, the latter of whom is an ancestor of Queen Camilla. Edward didn't just enjoy affairs, he institutionalized them, even going so far as to have a custom-built love seat designed for discreet trysts. Despite the scandal, his wife Queen Alexandra remained publicly loyal, tolerating his affairs with a mixture of quiet dignity and detachment. To Edward, love was an appetite of many to be satisfied, and preferably with style. But while his passions were physical, his great-granddaughter would develop a far subtler party trick involving dead-on impressions of some of the world's most powerful people. Queen Elizabeth II enjoyed impersonating heads of state, complete with voice and mannerisms. Though known globally for her stiff upper lip and unshakable composure, Queen Elizabeth II had a hidden talent few ever witnessed: mimicry. Behind the palace doors and far from the flashbulbs of the press, she delighted in impersonating world leaders. With uncanny accuracy, she could adopt the accents, gestures, and quirks of visiting dignitaries, leaving her inner circle in fits of laughter. Whether it was the dramatic hand movements of a foreign monarch or the clipped tone of a prime minister, Elizabeth's impressions were sharp, witty, and disarmingly spot on. She never performed them publicly. It would have been unthinkable, but those lucky enough to be in her inner circle spoke of these moments as rare glimpses into the Queen's dry humor and theatrical flair. It was her way of processing the endless parade of global figures who came through her life, blending observation with amusement. These impersonations weren't just playful, they were precise, almost forensic. And though she never let the public see this side, the habit painted her as more human than history books often allow. Yet even among her relatives, Elizabeth wasn't the only creative spirit. Her husband channeled his personality into an entirely different kind of art. Prince Philip painted abstract watercolors but only showed them to his close friends. Prince Philip, widely known for his blunt remarks and military bearing, also harbored a quieter, more introspective side expressed through abstract watercolor painting. While he spent much of his public life supporting the Queen and fulfilling royal duties, in private he turned to brushes, pigments, and paper to reflect a world he rarely verbalized. His paintings weren't realist or grand, they were often abstract, emotional, and full of swirling color. He never exhibited them publicly, never boasted, and never sold them. Instead, his art was shared only with a close circle of friends and family, often tucked away in private corners of Balmoral or Sandringham. Some who saw the works described them as surprisingly expressive, even melancholy. For a man whose public persona was steeped in stoicism and sarcasm, painting was likely one of the few outlets for emotional depth he otherwise kept locked away. It was a royal paradoxon of Britain's most visible men choosing a medium that allowed him to remain unseen. But if Philip painted in secret, his great-great-grandmother's children kept their own private amusement, mocking something the world would come to treat as sacred. Queen Victoria's children secretly made fun of her diary, which included notes like "ate toast, felt gloomy." Queen Victoria, the monarch who defined an era, kept a meticulous diary throughout her life spanning more than 60 years. These entries documented not only monumental state affairs but also mundane, sometimes comically trivial details. "Ate toast, felt gloomy," was one such line, emblematic of the dry, emotionless tone she often used to express even her darkest moods. Her children, particularly as they got older, found her diary entries unintentionally hilarious. In whispered tones and giggles behind palace walls, they mimicked the clipped monotony with which she described emotional events, the death of Prince Albert, major political developments, or even her own illnesses. They'd dramatize her writing in exaggerated tones, poking gentle fun at her habit of reducing sweeping emotional landscapes to terse sentences. Of course, none of this mockery ever reached the Queen herself. Victoria was not one to tolerate irreverence, especially from her offspring. Yet in their parody, her children gave voice to what many outsiders quietly thought: that Victoria, for all her power, kept the world at arm's length even on the page. And that detachment didn't just extend to her words, it was embodied in her husband's physical stature, which left him looking up literally to most of his court. King Charles I was only 5'4", making him one of the shortest British monarchs. In an era when physical height was often equated with authority and masculinity, King Charles I stood out quite literally for his small stature. Measuring just 5 feet 4 inches tall, he was one of the shortest British monarchs ever to sit on the throne. This wasn't just a footnote, it became part of the royal narrative. Courtiers often had to kneel or bow so low that Charles could maintain visual dominance, and paintings of the king were carefully crafted to make him appear taller and more commanding. He favored high-heeled shoes and voluminous robes, not just for fashion, but to mask his size. But despite his height, Charles cast a long political shadow. His reign culminated in a civil war, trial, and eventual executioner dramatic ending that proved you didn't need to be tall to topple a kingdom. Ironically, after his death, royalists claimed his body measured 5'10", sparking theories that his small frame in life had been exaggerated or deliberately downplayed by enemies. Regardless of truth, his legacy remains monumental. And speaking of legacies, his great-great-nephew William IV would go down in history for an entirely different reason, namely his shockingly lopsided family tree. King William IV had 10 illegitimate children, but 0 with his wife. King William IV, often referred to as the Sailor King for his long naval career, left behind a royal legacy that was as lopsided as it was scandalous. Before ascending the throne, William lived for over 20 years with actress Dorothea Jordan, during which time they had 10 children together, none of whom were legally recognized as heirs. Known as the Fitzclarence family, these children were afforded a strange half-status, acknowledged but unofficial, cherished yet sidelined. William was affectionate and generous toward them, securing positions and titles wherever he could. Yet when it came time to marry out of dynastic necessity, not love he wed Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. Their union was dutiful but tragic. None of their children survived infancy. Thus, the man who fathered 10 children out of wedlock died without a legitimate heir, leading to the accession of his niece, Queen Victoria. The oddity of William's family life wasn't just in the numbers, it was in the contradiction. He was a king who clearly loved being a father, yet failed to produce a single legal successor. But if William's story was one of misaligned legitimacy, his descendant would choose handbags over protocol when pushed too far. Princess Anne once chased a man down with her handbag after he insulted her hat. Princess Anne, often called the hardest-working royal, is known for her no-nonsense attitude and steely resolve. But one in Sidenthoff urban legend, half-palace confirmed lore reveals just how little patience she had for insults. During a public walkabout, a man reportedly made a disparaging comment about her hat, something along the lines of calling it a lampshade with feathers. Without missing a beat, Anne turned around and pursued the heckler with her handbag in hand. Witnesses claim she gave chase for several steps, swinging the bag like a woman possessed. While she didn't actually strike him, the gesture alone left everyone stunned and then roaring with laughter. Palace aides later dismissed the event as playful, but those who know Anne say she doesn't play around. The hat in question? a towering feathered creation she wore defiantly to several events afterward, almost as a challenge to future critics. The moment only added to Anne's reputation as the most straight-talking, unsentimental member of the royal family. She doesn't do drama, but she does do handbags. And while she used hers as a weapon of pride, her mother once used kitchenware for something even stranger: royal leftovers. Queen Elizabeth II took Tupperware to state banquets, so leftovers wouldn't be wasted. Despite reigning over vast wealth and global influence, Queen Elizabeth II had a surprisingly frugal streak-own that manifested in the most mundane of objects: Tupperware. According to former palace staff, the Queen was so opposed to waste that she sometimes brought plastic containers to state banquets just in case there were leftovers worth saving. At formal dinners with heads of state and glittering silverware, her practical food containers would quietly appear behind the scenes. It wasn't uncommon for palace aides to discreetly box up uneaten scones, biscuits, or finger sandwiches for her private consumption later. While this sounds absurdly down-to-earth for a monarch, it was entirely in character. Elizabeth had lived through rationing during World War II and never quite shook off the habits formed in those austere years. The idea of wasting perfectly good food, especially treats she enjoyed, struck her as silly. So while others were polishing off their caviar or sipping port, the Queen was planning lunch for tomorrow. Her Corgis, too, reportedly benefited from these leftovers. But not all royals were so humble about the resources they shared. One in particular referred to public transport with a nickname that would have sent shockwaves through Buckingham Palace. Prince Philip called the royal bus the peasant's box. Prince Philip, ever the icon of off-the-cuff commentary, rarely held back his thoughts, especially when it came to the trappings of royal life. One of his most infamous remarks came during discussions about the royal family using a specially outfitted bus for group travel to events. Upon seeing it, Philip allegedly referred to the vehicle as the peasant's box, a term so biting and unfiltered that it left aides speechless and many laughing nervously. While it's unclear if he meant it seriously or as a tongue-in-cheek jab, the nickname stuck among palace staff for years. The bus itself was no ordinary coach. It was luxurious by most standards, equipped with plush seating and climate control. But in Philip's eyes, it was still a box on wheels, and he loathed the idea of royals being herded like commoners. The phrase underscored his old-world views on hierarchy, class, and royal decorum, even in an era trying hard to modernize. His humor was always a bit caustic, laced with sarcasm, but it gave insight into the monarchy's inner contradictions. And speaking of appearances, another monarch once refused a mode of transport for a very different reason: his paranoia about how it made him look. George V refused to ride in an open carriage, claiming he looked too much like a melon. George V, the stoic patriarch of the House of Windsor, had a surprisingly humorous insecurity. He thought he looked ridiculous in an open carriage. Specifically, he once confided to aides that sitting upright and exposed made his round face and stiff posture resemble a melon on display. The image stuck, not just with those who heard it, but as an unspoken rule during his reign: limit open carriage appearances unless absolutely necessary. This wasn't a king concerned with assassination attempts or bad weather. It was vanity, pure and simple. George was intensely aware of how he appeared in public. Portraits were staged to exacting detail, uniforms were starched to perfection, and camera angles were closely monitored. His remark about the melon, though flippant, reflected a deeper discomfort with spontaneity and vulnerability. The open carriage, with its visibility from all sides, stripped away the protective cloak of royal distance. So he limited its use, opting for more enclosed and controlled settings whenever possible. And while he fretted over looking foolish, his mother-in-law took vanity to another level, acquiring furniture from guests and never returning it. Queen Mary of Teck borrowed antiques from nobles and never returned them. Queen Mary of Teck, consort to George V, had a well-earned reputation as a connoisseur of fine things, particularly antiques, but her passion for collecting often spilled into murkier territory. When visiting the country homes of British nobility, Mary would admire a particular vase, cabinet, or clock with conspicuous delight. Her hosts, well aware of etiquette, would usually offer the piece as a gift. And while many did so willingly, others found themselves caught in a royal trapone they couldn't escape without committing social suicide. In numerous cases, Mary didn't even wait for the formal offer. She would say something like, "Such a delightful piece. I think it would look well at Sandringham," and the item would promptly be borrowed. Needless to say, it was never returned. Over time, her collection grew not only in volume, but in infamy. Some noble families joked that entertaining Queen Mary was akin to hosting a very polite art thief, yet no one dared confront her. Her status made it impossible. The irony? Many of these pieces still sit in royal residences today, unlabeled and unacknowledged, but Mary wasn't the only royal with an eye for art. Her great-grandson would pick up a brush not to collect, but to create. King Charles III paints watercolors, some of which have sold for over £1 million. Behind the formality of titles and the layers of royal protocol, King Charles III has long nurtured a deeply personal and unexpected creative outlet, watercolor painting. It began as a form of stress relief during his younger years, offering solace from the rigid confines of public duty. But over time, it evolved into genuine artistic passion. Charles never formally trained at an art school, yet he developed a distinctive, gentle style, soft landscapes, pastoral scenes, and historic buildings rendered with delicate brushwork. His favorite subjects include the Scottish Highlands and country estates, and he often paints during holidays or quiet moments at Balmoral. At first, he shared his work only with close friends and staff, but eventually, his paintings were displayed at exhibitions, often for charitable causes. Surprisingly, some of these modest watercolors fetched upwards of £1 million, making Charles one of the best-selling living artists in the UK. Yet he insists he paints not for profit, but for peace of mind. In a family known for spectacle and ceremony, his art stands out as intimate, meditative, and strangely human. And speaking of hidden expressions, his former daughter-in-law had a secret dance space where she moved not for the public, but for herself. Princess Diana kept a dance studio in Kensington Palace, where she practiced ballet in secret. Princess Diana is remembered for her compassion, glamour, and tragic legacy, but few knew about the quiet sanctuary she kept hidden behind palace walls. Inside Kensington Palace, Diana had a private dance studio, a space she guarded from cameras, protocol, and even most visitors. It was there, surrounded by mirrors and hardwood floors, that she practiced Balather first love and emotional escape. In her youth, she had dreamed of becoming a professional dancer, but her height and royal responsibilities rendered the dream impossible. Still, she held on to it. Late at night or early in the morning, she would rehearse pirouettes, pliés, and expressive routines. Ballet became her therapy, a way to channel grief, anxiety, and the isolation she felt within the palace. Friends said she moved with grace, but it was the vulnerability behind the movement that was truly striking. In one famous moment, she even surprised the world by dancing with Wayne Sleep at the Royal Opera House, a glimpse into her private passion made public. But mostly, this studio remained her personal refuge. While she twirled alone in silk slippers, her father-in-law once immersed himself in something far less graceful an obsession with miniature warships. George VI loved model ships, and once built one taller than his children. George VI, known as the reluctant king who led Britain through World War II, had a fascination with precision and order, something that found a peculiar outlet in his love for model ships. More than a casual hobby, it bordered on obsession. The king had an entire room in Buckingham Palace devoted to shipbuilding, filled with wood shavings, paint pots, and tiny rigging wires. It was his escape from royal obligations, politics, and the constant strain of public life. One of his proudest achievements was a massive, meticulously detailed model of a British naval vessel so large that it towered over his young daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. He worked on it for months, sometimes late into the night, sanding and assembling every component by hand. His aides were baffled by the depth of his devotion, especially given his chronic health problems and demanding schedule. But the king found comfort in the methodical labor of shipbuilding. It was a way to exert control in a world spinning with war and duty. The finished models were proudly displayed and occasionally given as gifts to museums or military installations. Yet, for all his craftsmanship, he never quite found peace. His daughter, however, would later discover her own kind of daily ritual alone that started with a cocktail glass before lunch. If you're still with us after 33 royal oddities, you're clearly one of us, curious, bold, and maybe just a bit obsessed. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another dive into the bizarre side of history, and tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it as you explore the stranger side of the crown? Queen Elizabeth II drank a gin cocktail every day before lunch. Far from the stereotype of a tea-sipping monarch, Queen Elizabeth II was famously fond of a pre-lunch cocktail, and it wasn't a closely guarded secret among palace staff. Nearly every day, around midday, she was known to enjoy a gin and dubonnet served with a slice of lemon and plenty of ice. It was a habit she picked up early in adulthood, and she continued it well into her later years. The drink wasn't just a guilty pleasure. It became something of a ritual, a moment of pause amid the rigor of duty. Her fondness for the cocktail was so well established that some visiting diplomats and heads of state were offered the same concoction during informal palace meetings. The Queen reportedly referred to it as her royal refresher. And while her doctors eventually suggested she tone down the daily indulgence in her 90s, the tradition had long since become part of her legend. Unlike the more hedonistic drinking habits of past monarchs, Elizabeth's ritual was measured more of a calming custom than a sign of excess. And yet, while she sipped discreetly behind palace walls, one of her uncles would take personal control of time itself by banning clocks altogether. Edward VIII banned clocks in his home, claiming they created pressure. Edward VIII, the king who abdicated for love, seemed determined to live a life unfettered by the expectations of the throne and that included the ticking pressure of time. Once settled into exile in France with Wallace Simpson, Edward made a curious design choice for his home. He had almost all the clocks removed. To him, clocks represented stress, deadlines, and the mechanical heartbeat of duty he had left behind. Visitors often found themselves disoriented by the absence of any timekeeping device. If they asked the time, a butler might produce a pocket watch, but wall clocks and mantelpieces remained notably bare. The Duke of Windsor, as he was then known, insisted this created a freer lifestyle, one not governed by rigid timetables or social obligations. Wallace reportedly humored him, although she privately maintained a few watches of her own. This eccentricity became part of the aura surrounding Edward in exilia man, who had rejected the crown and, with it, any reminders of responsibility. But if Edward tried to erase time, his brother-in-law used it to make people squirm, dropping deadpan quips at the most unexpected moments, including one that involved a satellite and the possibility of royal destruction. Prince Philip once told a student building a satellite, "You're not going to blow us up, are you?" Prince Philip was a master of the unexpected remark, never quite inappropriate, but always riding the line. During a royal visit to a university science lab, he was introduced to a young student working on satellite technology. With his trademark wry grin and a glint in his eye, Philip leaned in and quipped, "You're not going to blow us up, are you?" The room went silent before erupting into awkward laughter. It was classic Philip. Irreverent, teasing, and entirely unscripted. To him, it was a jokier way to cut the tension and remind even the most brilliant minds that they were still, in his view, ordinary people. But for those not familiar with his humor, the line could feel unnerving. Over the decades, Philip built a reputation for such remarks, often delivered with the deadpan tone of a man who had seen too much ceremony and needed to poke holes in it. His humor was both a shield and a sword, a way to disarm and to distance. And while he cracked jokes, another royal of an earlier generation was struggling to breathe literally under the crushing pressure of a corset laced far too tight. King George IV wore corsets, laced so tightly he sometimes fainted. King George IV, known for his flamboyant taste and obsession with personal appearance, took vanity to painful extremes quite literally. Obsessed with maintaining an hourglass silhouette fashionable during his youth, George wore corsets so tightly laced that he occasionally fainted from lack of breath. Even as his waistline expanded significantly with age, thanks in no small part to his extravagant diet, refused to part with the garment that shaped his public persona. Tailors were summoned regularly to custom-fit increasingly larger corsets, which were then brutally cinched to give the illusion of a leaner frame beneath his military uniforms and embroidered coats. He was so committed to this illusion that staff were instructed not to assist him when the tightness caused dizzy spells. He preferred fainting to being seen as portly. Behind closed doors, courtiers whispered that the king's devotion to fashion bordered on self-torture. But George cared less for comfort than for appearance and echo of the theatrical royal image he worked so hard to project. His insecurities were wrapped in velvet and whalebone. Meanwhile, his future descendant, Princess Margaret, would cope with pressure in her own way by lighting up 60 times a day. Princess Margaret smoked 60 cigarettes a day, often in a gold holder. Princess Margaret, the younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, lived a life steeped in glamour, rebellion, and excess. Among her many vices was one that literally clouded every room she entered her: relentless chain smoking. On an average day, Margaret reportedly smoked upwards of 60 cigarettes, many of them held in an elegant, elongated gold holder that became as much a part of her image as her jewels or tiaras. Her smoking wasn't casual, it was ritualistic. She'd light a cigarette the moment she woke and continue through breakfast, lunch, cocktails, and late-night conversations. Ashtrays dotted every table in her residence, and staff were expected to ensure they were always within reach. Her voice, famously husky, bore the signature rasp of a lifelong smoker. Doctors warned her repeatedly, but Margaret rarely changed her habits until health forced her to. Even then, she was more likely to complain about poor lighting or bad upholstery than medical concerns. The gold holder added a touch of theatrical elegance to what was otherwise a grim addiction. And while Margaret lit cigarettes in gilded rooms, her nephew Charles would soon demand that even something as ordinary as toast be handled with princely precision. King Charles III is reportedly fussy about toast, demanding it be cooled on a rack. For most people, toast is a forgettable breakfast staple. For King Charles III, it's a delicate ritual requiring precise attention. Former palace staff have revealed that Charles prefers his toast to be not only perfectly browned but also cooled on a specific silver rack before it's served. This ensures it remains crisp rather than soggy, avoiding any hint of steam-softened texture. The process is so exacting that chefs in his household follow a toast protocol that would baffle most kitchen staff. Bread must be toasted evenly on both sides, allowed to cool for a precise period, and served at a particular angle on a warm plate. If it's even slightly too warm or the crust too dark, it's sent back. Some might call it pickiness, others see it as an example of lifelong pampering. But to Charles, the perfection of toast isn't trivial. It's a symbol of control in a life full of ceremonial chaos. It's one of many tiny rituals that structure his day, reminders that even in a world of immense responsibility, the crunch of bread must remain uncompromised. And as he quietly judged toast, his mother found surprising joy in something far more theatrical. Televised body slams and elbow drops. Queen Elizabeth II watched wrestling on television, calling it hilarious nonsense. One might assume that Queen Elizabeth II, ever the emblem of tradition and protocol, reserved her leisure time for period dramas or nature documentaries. But to the quiet surprise of those close to her, the Queen reportedly found joy in something far less refined professional wrestling. She referred to it affectionately as hilarious nonsense, and delighted in the over-the-top characters, theatrical body slams, and exaggerated bravado. The absurdity amused her, especially in contrast to the formal, tightly scripted world she inhabited daily. Wrestling, with all its flamboyant chaos, offered something she rarely experienced: escapism without responsibility. She'd sometimes watch matches with a chuckle, remarking on the costumes and dramatic flair. Palace staff recalled moments when she'd quietly tune in to catch a few matches, especially during the golden era of bombastic personalities. It wasn't about violence or sport, it was pure theater, and the Queen, surprisingly, had a taste for it. This curious habit was never publicly acknowledged, but in private, it added a wonderfully human wrinkle to her legacy. And while she chuckled at body slams and spandex, her husband was amassing a collection of silka, very different kind of flair hanging from his wardrobe. Prince Philip collected novelty ties, including one with dancing moose. Despite his reputation for no-nonsense military discipline, Prince Philip had a remarkably quirky fashion side best, captured by his fondness for novelty ties. Over the years, he amassed a collection that defied royal expectations: ties adorned with cartoon characters, animal prints, and even one featuring moose that appeared to dance mid-stride. These weren't worn to formal events, of course, but behind palace walls and during less public engagements, Philip enjoyed breaking the monotony with his colorful neckwear. To him, it was a subtle rebellion against the stiff, monochrome world of royal formality. The moose tie, in particular, became something of a joke among palace aides, who would try to guess which design he'd pick on casual days. Friends say he loved watching people's reactions, especially when they realized the Duke of Edinburgh, so often described as gruff and serious, had a quiet streak of mischief woven right into his collar. His collection became a reflection of the man himself: complex, surprising, and not easily pigeonholed. But if Philip wore his humor around his neck, his great-great-grandmother took it to the breakfast table where beer was the royal brew of choice. Queen Victoria enjoyed beer for breakfast, especially base pale ale. In an age when queens were expected to sip tea and nibble on scones, Queen Victoria was starting her mornings with something far more robust: beer. Specifically, she had a known fondness for Bass Pale Ale, and she didn't relegate it to afternoon leisure. At breakfast, it wasn't unusual for her to be served a chilled pint alongside eggs or meat. This was not seen as scandalous at the time. Beer was often considered a nutritious, safe alternative to water. But Victoria's devotion to the brew stood out, particularly as she continued the habit into her later years, long after other royals had moved on to more dainty habits. Her household staff were careful to present the ale properly, poured just so, in polished glassware and no mugs or tankards for the monarch. While the world remembers her for mourning Albert and maintaining the stiff upper lip of empire, her breakfast routine told another story. Here was a queen who, for all her power and propriety, appreciated a strong drink before noon. And as she savored her ale, one of her distant heirs would flip the scrip trading pints for patties in the most unexpected of royal job stints. Prince William once worked at a burger joint undercover for charity. Long before ascending to full-time royal duties, Prince William experienced life on the other side of the counter literally. As part of a charity initiative designed to raise awareness of everyday working-class experiences, William briefly took a job at a fast food restaurant. Donning a uniform, he worked incognito at the burger joint, flipping patties, taking orders, and cleaning tables. For a brief moment, the future King of England served fries to unsuspecting customers who had no idea they were face-to-face with royalty. He later described the experience as humbling and eye-opening, appreciating firsthand the pressure and rhythm of service work. Staff reportedly admired his willingness to jump in without complaint, though some were shocked once his identity was revealed. The stunt, though short-lived, wasn't just for headlines. It was part of a broader effort by William to stay grounded, connect with ordinary people, and challenge the perception of royalty as distant and untouchable. And while he may have gone back to palace life shortly after, the experience left an impression. Yet even this show of humility paled in comparison to his great-grandfather's idea of character building, which involved putting wild game on the menu, but only if you hunted it yourself. George V made his kids hunt their own Christmas dinner, calling it character building. To say George V was old-fashioned would be an understatement. A firm believer in discipline, tradition, and grit, he applied those principles even during the holidays. One of his more peculiar seasonal customs? Making his children hunt for their own Christmas dinner. No pre-roasted turkey or prepared pheasant if you wanted meat on your plate at Sandringham. You had to earn it with a rifle in the freezing woods. The royal children, including the future Edward VIII and George VI, were sent out with the expectation that they would return with something worthy of the holiday table. George V referred to this ritual as character building, a necessary lesson in responsibility and survival that separated royalty from pampered aristocracy. While staff were always present to ensure safety and perhaps to subtly steer game in the direction of their young marksmen, King insisted the kills be genuine. Failure to return with food wasn't punished, but it certainly wasn't applauded. This austere tradition left its mark, especially on George VI, who would later temper such harshness with a gentler spirit. And perhaps it was that emotional intelligence that led his daughter to adopt a color-coded coping mechanism to express what royal protocol would not. Queen Elizabeth II kept a diary with color-coded stickers for her moods. As sovereign of a global empire, Queen Elizabeth II maintained an image of unwavering composure, her face always calm, her voice steady no matter the crisis. But behind the regal mask, she developed a subtle, private system to express the emotions she couldn't show publicly. In her personal diary, the Queen used color-coded stickers to denote her moods. Blue for happy, yellow for anxious, red for angry, green for hopeful, each tiny circle a symbolic footprint of the day's emotional terrain. The diary itself was famously off-limits, even to her closest advisors. But palace insiders have confirmed the existence of the system, noting that it helped Elizabeth track her mental well-being through decades of duty. This was more than just quaint symbolism. It was her version of emotional honesty in a world that demanded stoicism. While her public speeches rarely wavered from the script, her diary was a sanctuary of color, expression, and truth. It also allowed her to reflect, measure patterns, and even anticipate how future events might affect her emotionally. And while her inner world was marked by small dots of meaning, her great-uncle found comfort in erasing all connections, especially when it came to the sound of human voices. Edward VII hated telephones and refused to have one installed. Edward VII, the very image of late Victorian and Edwardian opulence, had no love for the modern inventions springing up around him. Chief among his dislikes was the telephonia technology he loathed so deeply that he outright refused to have one installed in any of his personal residences. This was not a matter of unfamiliarity. By the time he reigned, phones were already gaining popularity among Europe's elite. But to Edward, the telephone was an offensive intrusion, its shrill ring, its disembodied voices, its imposition on his time. He saw it as an affront to decorum and privacy. If someone wanted to speak to the king, they could write a letter or request an audience through proper channels. Courtiers knew better than to suggest otherwise. His resistance wasn't merely personnel, it became policy. Official correspondence had to go through intermediaries, and even in emergencies, royal communication relied on messengers or telegrams. The irony, of course, is that the monarch of a nation driving the Industrial Revolution was, in private, wary of its tools. And while Edward rejected wires and bells, a future royal would find herself tangled in a scandalous moment of public embarrassment, this time involving hooves and handbags. Princess Anne's horse once kicked a diplomat, and she said he probably deserved it. Princess Anne, famously blunt and unsentimental, has long marched to the beat of her own Drummond, apparently. So have her horses. During a formal equestrian event attended by foreign dignitaries, one of Anne's prized horses kicked a diplomat who had wandered a bit too close to the animal's hind legs. The impact sent him stumbling backward, shaken but not seriously injured. While aides rushed to apologize and the diplomat dusted himself off, Anne reportedly delivered her now legendary quip. He probably deserved it. Whether she meant it as a joke or a dry assessment, the remark perfectly captured her reputation as the least filtered royal. Unlike other members of the family, Anne had little patience for small talk or ceremony. She was raised with military precision, excelled in competitive equestrianism, and famously resisted attempts to soften her public image. The incident with the diplomat became palace lore, retold at dinners and in whispers among staff. The horse, for its part, remained calm after the kickers, if taking its cue from its no-nonsense rider. But even Anne's rugged composure has nothing on the bizarre morning routine of her father, whose muttered profanity turned a simple shave into a daily ritual of royal frustration. George VI would mutter swear words while shaving, according to his valet. George VI, often depicted as the gentle and stammering monarch who led Britain through World War II, harbored a private frustration that erupted each morning in front of his mirror. According to his longtime valet, the king had a habit of muttering swear words under his breath while shaving, a daily ritual that turned into a quiet storm of profanities. The reasons varied. Some days it was the dullness of the blade, other times the stiffness of his collar or the prospect of a difficult meeting. But the result was the same: a steady, low-toned string of expletives accompanied by the rhythmic scrape of the razor. Never loud enough to draw attention, yet distinct enough that staff in the next room could occasionally catch snippets. This grumbling ritual was a release valve for a monarch who carried the immense weight of duty, war, and speech therapy. While he never allowed frustration to show in public, the bathroom mirror heard it all. His valet, fiercely loyal, never repeated the words, only the habit. It was a rare, human crack in the image of the steadfast king. And while he cursed the razor, his daughter would later wield the camera lens with surprising mischief, stealing the spotlight from two unsuspecting athletes. Queen Elizabeth II once photobombed two Australian athletes in Glasgow. For a monarch known for her polished demeanor and graceful reserve, Queen Elizabeth II could still surprise the world with a flash of playful rebellion. During the 2014 Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, two Australian field hockey players were posing for a selfie when the Queen, passing by in the background, leaned in and grinned directly into the shot. The image, instantly viral, showed her with a wide smile and sparkling eyes, proving that even at nearly 90, she still had impeccable comedic timing. It wasn't staged, rehearsed, or orchestrated by palace staff. It was, as confirmed by the athletes, completely spontaneous. The Queen had noticed them posing, paused briefly, and tilted her head into frame with the kind of timing you'd expect from a practiced performer. It was a rare and delightful breach of protocol from a monarch who had spent her entire life observing the rules. And it reminded the world that beneath the crown, scepter, and centuries of inherited tradition was a woman who could enjoy a bit of harmless mischief. While she mastered the art of surprise with a grin, her husband had his own unique way of catching people off guard by barbecuing in black tie. Prince Philip used to cook barbecues himself, even in full formal wear. Prince Philip never quite fit the mold of a quiet royal consort. He was a man of action, engineering, and impatience for fluff, and nothing exemplified this more than his approach to a good cookout. While others might expect a team of chefs to handle the grilling at royal retreats, Philip preferred to take control of the barbecue himself. What made it even more bizarre and charming was that he sometimes did this while dressed in full formal wear. On more than one occasion, guests recalled seeing him flipping sausages and tending coals while wearing a tuxedo or a military jacket adorned with medals. He wasn't trying to make a statement, just couldn't be bothered to change. Philip saw grilling as a practical art, and he had little interest in watching others do something he felt he could do better. His barbecues were both efficient and oddly regal, with burgers served from silver trays and condiments arranged with military precision. Despite the surreal contrast of black tie and barbecue smoke, it was Philip in his element, unfiltered, capable, and amusingly out of sync with traditional expectations. But even he, with all his quirks, didn't match the egg-centric eccentricity of his eldest son's royal breakfast ritual. King Charles III prefers perfectly circular eggs and has returned them, if too oval. Few details about King Charles III's routines have garnered more puzzled expressions than his obsession with breakfast eggs. Not just content with a soft-boiled yolk at exactly the right temperature, he is reported to be equally exacting about their shape. According to insiders, Charles has sent back eggs deemed too oval, preferring only those that are perfectly circular in form. The specificity borders on surreal. Staff at his country estate have been briefed on his preferences in great detail, from egg boiling timing, 4 minutes, not a second more, to the exact curvature of the shell. This fussiness may strike some as absurd, but for Charles, it's part of a broader pattern of hyper-attention to detail. Whether it's his shoelaces being ironed or his toothbrush being placed in the same position every morning, the breakfast egg is just one facet of a carefully controlled world. It's not about snobbery, at least not entirely, but about predictability and order, things he clings to in a life dictated by unpredictable public demands. Still, there's something uniquely eccentric about a monarch turning down eggs for being slightly egg-shaped. And while Charles critiqued his breakfast, his father refused to even watch the dramatized retelling of their family saga. Princess Margaret had a bathtub made of pink marble and only bathed in it with gin and tonic. Among the many indulgences of Princess Margaret, few capture her extravagance and flair for the dramatic like her custom pink marble bathtub. Installed at her Kensington Palace apartment, the tub was carved from a single slab of blush-colored marble, polished to perfection and surrounded by gilded fixtures. But the real twist wasn't the stone, it was her bathing ritual. Margaret insisted on taking her evening soaks only with a glass of gin and tonic in hand. It wasn't optional. Staff knew to prepare the drink in advance, complete with fresh lime and precisely the right ice cubes. The ritual was sacred, a blend of glamour, solitude, and defiance. She once told a guest, "There's no such thing as a bad day that can't be solved with marble and gin." Friends joked that she was trying to outdo Cleopatra in decadence. The bath wasn't just for cleanliness, it was a sanctuary where Margaret escaped, drank, smoked, and replayed the day. And just as her tub rituals were about control and atmosphere, her grandfather, King George V, had his own dinner table, demands though his obsession wasn't with alcohol, but with silence sharp enough to cut through a roast. George V demanded that all food be carved, silently, and banned loud chewing. For King George V, mealtime was less a social gathering and more a sacred ritual of order and control. Guests at his table quickly learned that the most dangerous sound wasn't political dissent, it was chewing. The king loathed unnecessary noise during meals, particularly loud cutting, scraping, or chewing. He issued strict orders that all food be carved silently, whether it was roast beef or game pheasant. Knives had to glide noiselessly, and servers were trained to present dishes with minimal clatter. Silverware was polished, not only for shine but for smoothness, so it wouldn't grind or scrape against plates. Those caught chewing too loudly earned a disapproving glare or worse, exclusion from future invites. George's obsession with table manners extended to the royal household, where even children were corrected mid-bite. His dinners weren't warm family affairs, they were orchestrated performances of discipline. And yet, generations later, his granddaughter would subvert such strictness by tuning into fictional aristocrats who both honored and mocked royal etiquette. But even in the realm of entertainment, Queen Elizabeth II had her opinions, and her favorite show came with one unexpected royal review. Elizabeth II loved Downton Abbey, but called it a bit too dramatic. Queen Elizabeth II, who famously lived in palaces and held audiences with world leaders, spent many evenings tucked under a blanket watching something surprisingly close to home, Downton Abbey. The ITV drama, chronicling the lives of British nobility and their servants, was a favorite in the Queen's private viewing list. But while she watched it religiously, she also had a running commentary, and it wasn't all praise. "A bit too dramatic," she reportedly remarked, often during moments of scandal or romantic turmoil. She preferred the quieter episodes, the ones focused on duty and decorum, and occasionally pointed out historical inaccuracies, especially when it came to royal protocol. Palace insiders say she particularly enjoyed identifying filming locations she had visited, and once mentioned she found the depiction of footmen rather exaggerated. Still, she never missed an episode. In a world that dramatized nobility, Elizabeth remained a lifelong observer who recognized that fact was often stranger than fiction. Her own family's ventures into modern media would go far beyond television, including a son's bold but short-lived adventure into show business, and endeavor that started with a camera and ended in awkward silence. Prince Edward tried to start a television production company, but it folded after 1 year. Prince Edward, the youngest child of Queen Elizabeth II, once sought a life outside the traditional royal mold, not through politics or military service, but by diving headfirst into show business. In 1993, he launched a television production company called Ardent Productions, hoping to carve a niche for himself as a serious media entrepreneur. The company was meant to produce documentaries and cultural programming, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the prince might forge a new royal media hybrid role. Unfortunately, the venture stumbled from the start. Ardent was criticized for its lackluster content, clumsy direction, and, most controversially, for trying to produce a documentary about Prince William at university, seen as a massive breach of royal privacy. The backlash was swift. Media outlets pounced, and the palace scrambled to contain the fallout. Ardent became a punchline in royal circles, and within a year, the company quietly folded, having never turned a meaningful profit. For Edward, the failure was both public and personal, a reminder that stepping into the limelight on his own terms wouldn't be so easy. And while he wrestled with camera lenses, his great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, was having her own emotional crisis, sparked not by scandal, but by a single misplaced portrait. Queen Victoria once locked herself in her room for days after a servant moved a picture of Albert. Grief doesn't always speak in grand gestures. Sometimes it hides in the details like a single framed photo. For Queen Victoria, the death of Prince Albert shattered her emotionally, and she spent the rest of her life mourning him in both grand and minute ways. One of the most telling examples came when a palace servant, likely trying to tidy up, moved a beloved portrait of Albert from its usual place. The Queen noticed immediately. In response, she didn't scold, she didn't shout, she simply withdrew. Victoria locked herself in her private chamber and refused to come out for several days. She ate in silence, declined visitors, and wouldn't speak to staff. The message was clear. This wasn't about a photo, it was about a fracture in the fragile structure of her grief. The image had been her anchor, her quiet companion through the long decades of widowhood. To touch it was to tamper with sacred ground. Eventually, the portrait was returned, and Victoria re-emerged, but the staff never forgot the lesson. Some even whispered that the photo was now more royal than the Queen herself, and while Victoria grieved her lost love, a far more modern royal would turn his bedroom into something just as sacred, though lined with teddy bears, not memories. Prince Andrew had 72 teddy bears arranged in strict order, and maids were scolded for errors. Among all the rumors and realities of Prince Andrew's life, one of the most baffling may be his bedtime companion's 72 teddy bears, each placed with military precision. According to former palace staff, Andrew's bears weren't just keepsakes from childhood, they were a regiment of plush soldiers arranged daily in a specific order across his bed. Each bear had a designated spot, and some even had names and unique accessories. There was a chart showing their proper placement. Heaven help the maid who got it wrong. If a bear was out of place, too far left, slightly tilted, or paired with the wrong neighbor, Andrew was known to throw tantrums. Maids were given strict instructions, and new hires received full training on bear duty. Some staff found the whole routine laughable, others deeply unsettling. But for Andrew, the bears provided comfort, control, and perhaps a link to simpler times. The behavior was never publicly acknowledged by the prince, but stories of the bears circulated widely among palace insiders. And just as Andrew orchestrated plush regiments in his private chambers, his mother occasionally orchestrated her own private theater, this time with a rake in hand and a prank up her sleeve. Queen Elizabeth II once pranked foreign dignitaries, pretending she was a gardener. Queen Elizabeth II may have been the most photographed woman in history, but that didn't stop her from occasionally blending into the background, especially when mischief was on her mind. During a low-key walk around the Balmoral estate, a group of American tourists spotted a petite older woman in a headscarf and raincoat tending to flowers. They approached politely and asked if she lived nearby. With her signature deadpan grace, the Queen replied, "Yes, I live here." They pressed further, asking if she'd ever met the Queen. "No," she said with a wry smile, "but he has," pointing to her security guard. It wasn't a one-time act. Elizabeth was known to occasionally pretend to be a common gardener or estate staff when not in formal wear, especially when she encountered unsuspecting guests or foreign dignitaries. These small pranks delighted her and her staff because they flipped the script. For once, she wasn't the center of attention. She was just a clever lady in the garden, pulling royal rank only after the punchline landed. And while her humor leaned subtle and dry, her former daughter-in-law preferred a sharper, more rebellious approach, like anonymously trolling the royal family through tabloid headlines. Princess Diana sent jokes to tabloids anonymously, mocking her in-laws. Princess Diana was often portrayed as the tragic royal she, elegant and misunderstood. But behind the scenes, she had a wicked sense of humor and a flair for satire. During the height of her strained relationship with the royal family, Diana began sending anonymous jokes, quips, and even cartoons to British tabloids, poking fun at royal formalities, fashion, and, on occasion, specific family members. Editors who received these anonymous notes often suspected her identity due to the insider tone and uncanny accuracy, but none dared expose her. The jokes were never cruel, but they were pointed. Some poked fun at Prince Charles's love of talking to plants, while others mocked outdated palace etiquette or exaggerated the Queen's Corgi obsession. For Diana, it was more than comedy, it was catharsis. Her secret contributions allowed her to reclaim narrative power in a world that constantly spun stories around her. Palace insiders suspected the truth, but no one confronted her outright. The Princess of Wales had found her own way to cope with wit and stealth. And just as Diana used humor to jab at royal stiffness, her ex-husband would carry on a far more peculiar obsession with eggs timed to military precision. King Charles III has a soft-boiled egg every day at exactly 7:45 a.m. and discards them if they're overcooked. King Charles III is known for his love of tradition and detail, but none more obsessively than his morning egg. Every day at precisely 7:45 a.m., palace staff are tasked with preparing a soft-boiled egg to his exacting standards. The yolk must be perfectly runny, but not too liquid. The whites firm, but never rubbery. The timing, the temperature, and even the shell's smoothness are all critical. If the egg is slightly overcooked, undercooked, or misshapen, it is summarily rejected. No discussion, no second chance. There are rumors that multiple eggs are cooked each morning, just in case one fails inspection. Charles isn't rude about it, just unwavering. For him, the ritual is a grounding moment in a day, often filled with global meetings, state affairs, and public scrutiny. It's not about luxury, it's about order. Something predictable. Something right. This daily egg ceremony, strange as it may sound, encapsulates the king's lifelong search for harmony through control. And while Charles rules over breakfast with a cracked egg and a stopwatch, his father once ruled over barbecues with a helicopter rotor and a tuxedo because, of course, he did. Prince Philip refused to watch The Crown, calling it fantasy soap. While millions of viewers worldwide were glued to the royal dramatics of The Crown, one man remained staunchly unimpressed: Prince Philip. Despite being a central character in the acclaimed series, he reportedly refused to watch a single episode. According to insiders, he dismissed the show as a fantasy soap, making it clear that he considered the dramatizations little more than speculative fiction cloaked in regal costumes. It wasn't the first time Philip had bristled at portrayals of his life, but the Crown hit especially close to home fictionalizing personal conflicts, private conversations, and emotional tensions that the royal family had kept under wraps for decades. To Philip, whose public image was already shaped by misunderstanding and sharp-tongued sound bites, the idea of actors exploring his inner turmoil was not just intrusive, it was insulting. While the rest of the world debated the show's accuracy, Philip's stance remained firm. He lived it. He didn't need to see it. His reaction underscored the delicate balance between public fascination and private reality. But while Philip bristled at modern storytelling, one of his ancestors had an equally uneasy relationship with a different kind of image, believing that the camera itself could steal a part of the soul. Queen Victoria believed photography stole the soul, but Saturday for hundreds of portraits. Anyway, in the Victorian era, photography was still a new and mysterious technology, and Queen Victoria harbored deep reservations about it. She reportedly believed that cameras might steal the soul, echoing a superstition that dated back centuries. The notion wasn't entirely uncommon at the time, especially for a monarch raised in a world of oil portraits and regal stillness. And yet, paradoxically, Victoria sat for hundreds of photographs over her long reign. These images helped define the visual identity of the British monarchy, spreading her stern expression and widow's garb across the globe. Her relationship with the camera was complex. She feared its power, yet understood its necessity. Photographs made her real to her subjects, connecting the crown to an expanding empire. Still, she never fully relaxed in front of the lens. Her expressions were often stoic, her posture rigid as if bracing herself against the invisible pull of the machine. In many images, she looks less like a queen and more like a woman enduring something unpleasant out of duty. But while Victoria grappled with the camera's soul-snatching myths, one of her descendants would fully embrace visual indulgence, installing something wildly decadent right above his royal bed. Edward VIII had a mirror ceiling installed above his bed in France. Long after abdicating the throne, Edward VIII, the Duke of Windsor, retreated into a world of gilded exile and unapologetic self-indulgence. In his lavish home in France with Wallis Simpson, he had one of the most infamous and eyebrow-raising features installed in the master bedroom, a mirror ceiling. Positioned directly above the bed, the mirror was no accident of interior design. It was a deliberate, sensual choice that spoke volumes about Edward's personality and priorities. The former king had long been known for his vanity, and the ceiling reflected both his physical narcissism and his appetite for decadence. While the rest of the house was filled with antique furniture and rare books, the bedroom was its own theater, private, provocative, and undeniably flamboyant. For Edward, the mirrored ceiling wasn't just a bedroom ornament, it was a statement, a final rejection of royal restraint in favor of personal pleasure. It scandalized visitors, amused his inner circle, and became part of the legend that surrounded the man who gave up a crown for love. Yet even as Edward gazed upward in self-reflection, another king was looking down not at himself, but at scores and statistics from an unexpected battlefield, the cricket pitch. George V kept a cricket scorebook during World War I. While the world around him crumbled under the weight of the First World War, King George V maintained a peculiar form of mental escape through cricket. Amid the chaos of global conflict, troop movements, and political pressure, he found a strange kind of solace in keeping a personal cricket scorebook. He didn't just follow the sport, he meticulously recorded players' names, match results, and batting averages, sometimes with more focus than he applied to war briefings. In meetings with military leaders, aides noted that his mind would often drift toward match outcomes and county stats. It wasn't indifference. George V was deeply invested in the war effort, but rather a coping mechanism. Cricket, with its rigid structure and traditions, offered a form of comforting order against the backdrop of carnage and confusion. While bombs fell in Europe and telegrams reported the dead, the King of England quietly documented innings and run rates with a pencil and ruler. His devotion to the sport was unshaken by global collapse. And as George V tracked wickets and overs, his granddaughter would inherit a very different kind of tracking skillone involving feathers, beaks, and pigeons too ordinary for a royal pedigree. Queen Elizabeth II could identify any breed of pigeon, a skill learned from her father. Before she was queen, Elizabeth was a young girl trained not just in etiquette and royal ceremony, but also in the decidedly unroyal art of pigeon identification. It was a skill passed down from her father, George VI, who kept racing pigeons as a personal hobby and encouraged his daughters to understand their varieties. Elizabeth took to the task with quiet diligence, learning to distinguish between homing pigeons, show breeds, and regional hybrids with startling accuracy. Even in adulthood, she retained the ability to identify breeds at a glance, often surprising professional breeders and agricultural fair contestants with her encyclopedic knowledge. Her interest wasn't for show, it was genuine. Pigeons held a special place in royal tradition, particularly as wartime messengers, and the Queen admired their reliability and instinct. At Sandringham and Balmoral, she frequently visited the royal pigeon lofts, sometimes spending hours observing their behavior. Staff recalled moments when she corrected even seasoned handlers on breed specifics. It was a strange but charming aspect of a monarch otherwise known for protocol and poise. And while she quietly categorized birds, her son developed a more peculiar grooming habit, insisting that even his shoelaces meet royal standards of perfection. King Charles III prefers his shoelaces ironed. Among King Charles III's many fastidious habits, one of the most head-scratching is his insistence that his shoelaces be ironed, yes, ironed daily, and to a specific degree of flatness. It may seem excessive, but for Charles, who thrives on ritual and precision, even the most seemingly mundane parts of his wardrobe are carefully managed. According to former royal staff, the shoelaces must be removed from the shoes, stretched flat, and pressed with a warm iron to eliminate creases and maintain their pristine form. The purpose isn't entirely cosmetic. Charles reportedly finds wrinkled laces uncomfortable and claims they affect the way his shoes feel during long engagements. It's part of a broader pattern of attention to minute details. His pajamas are pressed, his toothpaste is reportedly measured to a specific length, and now, his laces must lie flat as the carpet in Clarence House. Staff follow the routine with military precision, fully aware of the disapproval that might follow a single overlooked wrinkle. While some call it neurotic, others see it as consistency in a life filled with constant public scrutiny. And as he steps into his iron shoes, his sister carries an equally firm opinion this time about one of Netflix's most popular dramas. Princess Diana once danced with John Travolta and regretted it forever. At first glance, it seemed like a fairy tale moment. Princess Diana, radiant in a midnight blue velvet gown, gliding across the White House floor in the arms of John Travolta. The year was 1985, and the event was a glamorous state dinner hosted by President Ronald Reagan. Cameras flashed, the press swooned, but behind Diana's famous smile, the experience left a bitter aftertaste. Though the dance became one of the most iconic images of her royal life, she later confided that it felt orchestrated and awkward, a stage spectacle rather than a magical moment. She hadn't requested the dance. It had been prearranged by palace aides and American hosts eager for a headline. Diana felt cornered, playing a part in a performance she hadn't scripted. Travolta, ever gracious, did his best to charm her, but for Diana, the moment epitomized the loneliness and artificiality of royal life. She became a symbol, a mannequin in a global showroom, spinning under chandeliers while her real desires remained muted. That iconic photo lives on but for Diana. It became a glittering ghost of a night she never wanted to remember. Meanwhile, her younger son would take his escapism not to the dance floor, but straight into his helmet. Prince Harry hid a PlayStation in his helmet during army training. When Prince Harry entered military training at Sandhurst, he was determined to be seen as a soldier first and a royal second, but that didn't mean leaving behind all traces of civilian comfort. In one of the cheekiest stunts to emerge from his army days, Harry reportedly smuggled a PlayStation console into the barracks and hid it inside his helmet case. The console became his secret lifeline during grueling training sessions, a way to decompress from the relentless demands of drills, discipline, and hierarchy. He'd sneak in gaming sessions between lights out and early morning wake-ups, controllers hidden under his cot. Fellow cadets, once they caught on, were more amused than offended. To them, it showed that even a prince needed an escape hatch. For Harry, it was a quiet rebellion, maintaining a bit of normalcy in an environment designed to strip identity down to rank and routine. His superiors eventually discovered the ruse, but by then, Harry had already earned a reputation as someone willing to push the envelope. And speaking of royal surprises, his grandmother, who ruled through stoicism and protocol, once delighted in the most mischievous holiday of the year with a joke that echoed through the halls of diplomacy. Queen Elizabeth II celebrated April Fool's Day and once replaced a diplomat's chair with a whoopee cushion. For all her regal restraint, Queen Elizabeth II had a mischievous side-dome that revealed itself in subtle pranks and perfectly timed jokes. Her favorite occasion to unleash it? April Fool's Day. Far from being above a bit of harmless fun, the Queen reportedly orchestrated playful surprises for her inner circle, staff, and even unsuspecting diplomats. One of the most famous stories involves a foreign ambassador visiting Buckingham Palace for a formal luncheon. Unbeknownst to him, the Queen had arranged for a whoopee cushion to be placed discreetly on his seat. As he settled into the plush chair, the unmistakable sound echoed through the grand dining room. There was a stunned silence, then a ripple of laughter as the Queen smiled knowingly. It was a moment of levity that no one in attendance would ever forget. Palace aides confirmed that she loved pulling these mild pranks, especially on days when protocol was usually most rigid. Her sense of humor was dry, precise, and utterly unexpected, an antidote to the stiff expectations of royal decorum. While her image remained polished in public, those closest to her knew she had a twinkle in her eye and a trick or two up her sleeve. And if her jokes were light, her father's technology habits were anything but forever stuck in the last century. George VI never mastered using a telephone, and had aides dial for him. Though George VI led Britain through World War II with bravery and steadiness, his comfort with modern technology lagged behind the expectations of his time. Nowhere was this more evident than in his uneasy relationship with the telephone. Despite being king in an era when telecommunications were becoming essential to governance and military coordination, George VI never quite figured out how to use a telephone properly. He was famously uncomfortable with the device, not just because of his well-known stammer, but due to a deeper sense of awkwardness about its mechanics. Palace aides were routinely tasked with dialing numbers for Even for casual or personal calls. In many cases, they would stay close by in case the line disconnected or if the king needed help navigating the conversation. He preferred written memos, telegrams, or in-person meetings over the disembodied voice on the other end of the line. His hesitation wasn't laziness, it reflected his broader discomfort with modernity. Despite the rapid changes unfolding during his reign, George remained a monarch of habit-rooted in rituals, protocol, and pen and paper communication. Ironically, while he struggled with technology, his wife's wardrobe evolved with precision, especially in the hat department, where no repeat was ever allowed. Queen Mary insisted on a new hat for every public event, totaling over 2,000. Queen Mary of Tech, consort to George V and grandmother to Queen Elizabeth II, took fashion not as frivolity, but as a royal obligation. Chief among her sartorial obsessions were hats ornate, commanding, and never repeated. For every public event she attended, Queen Mary insisted on wearing a brand new hat, a rule she upheld so strictly that it's estimated she amassed a collection of over 2,000 during her lifetime. These weren't simple accessories. They were architectural statements, plumed, veiled, feathered, and often adorned with lace or brooches. Milliners across Britain benefited greatly from her unwavering demand for originality. Wardrobe staff were tasked with ensuring each hat was catalogued and never reused, lest the Queen risk appearing predictable in public. The sheer volume of headwear required its own system of storage, with entire rooms in royal residences filled with hat boxes labeled and archived by date, venue, and gown pairing. For Queen Mary, the hat was not just an accessory, it was an extension of royal image and authority. And while she summoned servants with fashion, her granddaughter would summon them with sound specifically, the unmistakable ring of a bell, even in the most unlikely of places. Princess Margaret kept a bell to summon servants, even on private islands. Princess Margaret, known for her imperious charm and unapologetic demands, carried her expectations of royal service everywhere she went, even on holiday. One of her lesser-known habits involved traveling with a handheld service bell, which she used to summon staff at her leisure. Even on Mustique, her favorite private Caribbean island retreat where many royals and celebrities sought informality, Margaret remained ever the aristocrat. Staff who worked at her villa recalled how she'd ring the bell for everything from an extra gin and tonic to assistance adjusting the lighting. The bell was no different from the ones used in palaces, save for the change in scenery. It was a tiny chime that symbolized a towering sense of entitlement. Margaret's island retreat may have looked like paradise, but within it functioned a strict hierarchy. Guests were expected to adhere to certain standards: no late arrivals, no barefoot appearances at dinner, and no interrupting her afternoon nap. The bell's chime became a kind of tropical metronome, marking time in service of one woman's royal comfort. And while Margaret rang hers for indulgence, her nephew Charles would later brush his teeth wrapped in embroidery, donning a robe more suited to a sultan than a sovereign. King Charles III wears a velvet bathrobe with gold embroidery, even while brushing teeth. If morning routines reveal the man, then King Charles III begins each day with the flair of an emperor. Among his many lavish habits, none stands out quite like his choice of attire for brushing his teeth: a velvet bathrobe adorned with gold embroidery. Not cotton, not terry cloth. Velvet, often deep burgundy, or royal blue, with gilded trim swirling down the lapels and sleeves. This isn't a garment kept for show or state. Charles wears it as part of his private comfort routine. Even when preparing for an ordinary day, he dresses like a figure from a Renaissance portrait. Former staff members have commented on the peculiarity of watching him perform mundane tasks, such as flossing or inspecting his hairline while looking like a character from the Three Musketeers. The robe, said to be custom-made, reflects his lifelong appreciation for craftsmanship, traditional tailoring, and a touch of the theatrical. While some royals cling to routines for simplicity, Charles does it for aesthetics. He believes beauty should exist in every detail, even toothpaste. And while he tended the fire of ritual, his father once built his own fire outdoors using a helicopter part to grill steaks in formal attire. Prince Philip once built a barbecue grill from a helicopter rotor. Leave it to Prince Philip to turn a piece of military hardware into a cooking device. In one of his most delightfully eccentric moments, the Duke of Edinburgh built a working barbecue grill using part of a helicopter rotor. It wasn't a one-off stunt for attention. It was pure Philip-practical, inventive, and laced with dry humor. The rotor blade, repurposed into a horizontal spit or firebox, accounts vary, became the centerpiece of his grilling station at Balmoral. Guests, including visiting heads of state and family members, often found themselves eating sausages cooked over military-grade engineering. Philip had a lifelong fascination with machines and could often be found tinkering in workshops, away from the pomp of palace life. The barbecue rotor was both a conversation piece and a symbol of his disdain for fuss. Who needs a store-bought grill when you have an old chopper and a welding torch? Staff joked that the only thing more dangerous than his jokes were his barbecue tools. But despite his love for engineering, Philip's wife preferred horsepower of a very different kind that came with leather seats, country roads, and the occasional secret joyride. Queen Elizabeth II secretly drove her Range Rover around Windsor, wearing a scarf and sunglasses. Though chauffeured nearly everywhere in her public role, Queen Elizabeth II had a passion for driving that never dimmed. On the expansive grounds of Windsor Castle, away from the press and protocol, she would often slip behind the wheel of her Range Rover, don a simple scarf over her hair, throw on a pair of oversized sunglasses, and take off for a solo ride. These unannounced drives were her personal escape, moments where she could be in control, no aides, no security trailing her at a polite distance, just the hum of the engine and the freedom of the countryside. Locals occasionally spotted her on lesser-used paths, always driving with careful precision, eyes straight ahead. It wasn't unusual for guards or staff to see her zipping by, barely recognizable without the crown or pearls. She had been trained as a driver and mechanic during World War II, and she never lost her confidence behind the wheel. These secret drives became one of her most cherished routines, a way to experience ordinary pleasure amid the extraordinary demands of monarchy. And while she cruised through the English landscape in disguise, her son Edward was donning one of his own, in the form of a fluffy white costume. Prince Edward once dressed as a rabbit for a charity ball and stayed in character all night. Of all the eccentric moments to emerge from the quieter corners of the royal family, Prince Edward's full commitment to absurdity at a charity ball may be one of the most bizarrely endearing. For a themed fundraiser, Edward arrived in a full-body white rabbit, costume floppy ears, puffy tail, and all. But rather than treat it as a throwaway outfit for a few laughs, he remained in character for the entire evening. Guests were both bewildered and entertained as the Queen's youngest son hopped sometimes literally from table to table, offering carrots from a basket and speaking in a high-pitched rabbit voice. He reportedly even declined drinks using pantomime rather than speech, staying true to his silent bunny persona. Some found it charming, others cringeworthy, but all agreed it was unforgettable. For Edward, long considered the most theatrical of the Queen's children, the costume was more than a joke, it was performance art. Perhaps it was his way of embracing the royal tradition of pageantry with a twist of self-deprecation. After all, the Windsors are no strangers to unusual rituals. Just ask his mother, who once showed surprising tenderness in the most rural corner of the monarchy, sending handwritten notes to her cows. Queen Elizabeth II named her cows and sent handwritten notes to the dairy staff. Though she ruled over realms and signed acts of parliament, Queen Elizabeth II never forgot the quiet dignity of her four-legged subject, particularly her dairy cows at Windsor. These weren't nameless livestock grazing on royal land. The Queen knew them by name and temperament. She took an active interest in their health, diet, and milk production, often asking for updates and sending handwritten notes to the dairy staff. These notes included praise, inquiries, and occasionally, small instructions. It was not uncommon for her to write, "Please give Daisy an extra handful of barley," or "Be gentle with Buttercup, she's expecting." For a monarch often viewed as distant or formal, this pastoral devotion revealed a deeply human side. Her affection for animals extended far beyond Corgish, was genuinely connected to the land and those who worked it. When visiting the stables and fields, she preferred walking the grounds rather than riding in a car, stopping to check the sheds and even coo to her cows in a soft voice. The royal herd was one of the oldest in Britain, and under her watchful eye, they were treated not as assets, but as trusted companions. Meanwhile, one of her daughters-in-law had a decidedly less sentimental way of venting stress-bee flinging darts at familiar faces. Princess Diana kept a dartboard with press photos on it. Princess Diana had a complicated relationship with the press adored in headlines but hounded in real life. Behind closed doors at Kensington Palace, she found a uniquely satisfying, if slightly unorthodox, way to deal with the constant tabloid invasion, a dartboard covered with press clippings and paparazzi photos. Tucked away in a private room, the board featured the faces of particularly aggressive photographers, snarky columnists, and editors who'd spun cruel or misleading stories about her. With a glass of wine in one hand and a dart in the other, Diana would release her frustration with bullseye precision, sometimes inviting close friends to join in the cathartic game. It wasn't about violence, it was about reclaiming a sliver of power in a world that never gave her any privacy. For someone who was constantly scrutinized, chased, and portrayed through a distorted lens, this personal ritual offered both humor and emotional relief. Her staff knew about it, but never spoke publicly, understanding that even the most public figures need private coping mechanisms. The board changed often, updated with each new scandal or smear. But while Diana aimed darts at headlines, her ex-husband would find companionship in something much smaller and furrier than a royal corgi. King Charles III prefers squirrels over cats and has names for his garden squirrels. In a family famous for its fondness for dogs, King Charles III has developed a surprising affinity for another creature entirely: squirrels. While most would consider them garden pests or fleeting woodland visitors, Charles treats them more like treasured guests or, in some cases, like tiny nobles in their own right. At his Scottish residence of Birkhall, he's reportedly taken to feeding the red squirrels by hand, sometimes even inviting them inside the house. But what makes this habit truly peculiar is that he's given names to several of the squirrels who frequent his garden. He claims to recognize them individually by their mannerisms, coloring, or preferred hiding spots. Palace staff have confirmed seeing Charles speak to them gently, offering seeds or nuts and watching with quiet amusement as they scurry about. His affection isn't performative, he's genuinely fascinated by their behavior. He once said they're remarkably intelligent and lamented their shrinking population in the UK due to invasive grey squirrels. While most monarchs focus on statecraft, Charles finds respite in the rustle of leaves and the flick of a bushy tail. And speaking of tales, his father once delivered punchlines, even stranger jokes so odd they somehow involved penguins and nuns. Prince Philip's favorite joke involved penguins and nuns. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was known for his sharp tongue and irreverent humor, so much so that his jokes sometimes required a translator and a trigger warning. But among his endless vault of quips and one-liners, there was one joke he loved more than most. It involved a penguin walking into a convent, asking to join the choir, only to be told by a puzzled nun, "We don't take birds with beaks that big." The punchline was nonsensical, the logic baffling, but Philip delivered it with such deadpan seriousness that listeners couldn't help but laugh, if only from the absurdity. He told it at dinner parties, to heads of state, and once even to a class of school children, where it landed with mixed results. What made the joke memorable wasn't its content, but Philip's total commitment to the cetaphis faux gravitas, dramatic pauses, and arched brow as if he were reciting a diplomatic treaty. It was a small window into a mind that relished deflating pomp with ridiculousness. And while Philip wielded jokes like arrows, his wartime son George VI turned instead to more delicate acts of escape, one involving paintbrushes and tin soldiers during the world's darkest hours. George VI painted tiny toy soldiers by hand, even during WWI. Even as the world descended into the chaos of World War II, King George VI found solace not only in duty but in a deeply private, almost childlike hobby painting miniature toy soldiers by hand. In between war briefings, national broadcasts, and solemn meetings with generals, the king would retreat to a quiet room and sit for hours, meticulously painting figures no taller than a matchstick. His soldiers were crafted in painstaking detail: tiny red coats, polished buttons, gold braid, and careful facial expressions. For George, the act was more than a pastime, was meditation. It offered a brief reprieve from the crushing responsibility of leading a nation under siege. His daughter, Princess Elizabeth, was sometimes allowed to observe, though rarely permitted to interrupt. The little soldiers weren't just painted. They were arranged into regiments and even small dioramas on the palace floor, a private world of order and control in a time when neither seemed certain. Staff recalled the faint scent of enamel paints drifting through the halls, a quiet contrast to the tension outside. And just as George found relief in these inch-high warriors, his daughter would come to find comfort in a cocktailone that would earn an affectionate royal nickname of its own. Queen Elizabeth II called her gin the Royal Refresher. Amid the pageantry, protocols, and centuries of expectation, Queen Elizabeth II maintained one remarkably consistent habit that followed her from castle to castle: her pre-lunch gin and Dubonnet cocktail, affectionately known among close staff as the Royal Refresher. Served with a slice of lemon and a couple of ice cubes, it was her signature midday indulgence, a quiet, sparkling punctuation mark between royal engagements. Though she never spoke about it publicly, those close to her confirmed that it was more than a habit, it was a ritual. The nickname itself, whispered by palace aides and eventually adopted in casual conversation, reflected its place in her tightly regimented routine. It was always prepared to exact specifications, never too strong, never too diluted, and often sipped in solitude before formal luncheons or quiet afternoon reading. Far from being a symbol of extravagance, the drink grounded her. It was one of the rare things in her day that was just for her, untouched by duty. While many remember her for teacups and gloves, those in the know always think of the subtle clink of glass at noon. But while she sipped in private, her only daughter didn't hold back her opinions, especially when it came to fictionalized portrayals of their family legacy. Princess Anne has never watched a full episode of The Crown and calls it rubbish. If Queen Elizabeth II was quietly amused by the dramatization of her life, Princess Anne took an entirely different stanchion sharpened by a famously dry wit and an almost allergic reaction to nonsense. Asked in an interview whether she'd ever watched The Crown, the long-running Netflix series chronicling her family's private affairs, Anne responded with characteristic bluntness, "Number, and I haven't the slightest intention to." She went further, reportedly calling the show rubbish, much to the delight of royal watchers who'd come to expect nothing less from the no-nonsense Princess Royal. To Anne, The idea of actors attempting to portray deeply personal family dynamics for global entertainment was not just intrusive, it was ludicrous. She viewed the show as melodrama, dressed in ermine, fiction disguised as biography. Friends say that even hearing clips or summaries of certain episodes made her visibly roll her eyes. And while the rest of the world dissected casting choices and story arcs, Anne remained unmoved, preferring horses, hard work, and reality to the glossy sheen of streaming content. Her intolerance for dramatized royalty extended to every aspect of palace life, including food, so it's little surprise that her nephew would inherit that same pickiness, particularly when it came to tomatoes. Prince William hated tomatoes so much, he banned them from royal kitchens. Among the future king's many preferences, one stands out for its sheer vehemence. Prince William cannot stand tomatoes. Not in salads, not in sandwiches, not even disguised in sauces. In fact, the Duke of Cambridge reportedly dislikes them so intensely that he once had them banned from being served in royal kitchens, at least during meals where he was present. Chefs were instructed to create workarounds, replacing tomatoes with red peppers, beetroot, or even strawberries in salads to preserve visual appeal without triggering his distaste. It wasn't a dietary restriction or allergy, just an unwavering personal aversion. Friends and former staff have said that William's tomato hatred dates back to childhood, where even a stray slice could ruin a meal. Unlike other food preferences that mellow with age, his dislike seems to have intensified over the years. In a family famous for tolerating tradition and swallowing discomfort with a smile, his refusal to accommodate even a cherry tomato is both amusing and rare. But the culinary quirks don't end there. His father now, King Charles III, takes it a step further, carrying an ingredient so sacred to him, it travels wherever he does. King Charles III insists on bringing his own organic honey when he travels. Among the many peculiarities that follow King Charles III across the globe, few are as sticky literally and figuratively as his devotion to his personal stash of organic honey. Wherever he goes, whether on state visits or personal retreats, Charles reportedly ensures that jars of his favorite honey accompany him, tucked carefully among his travel essentials. It's not just any honey, it must be organic, locally sourced from trusted suppliers, and sometimes even produced on one of his royal estates. For the king, this isn't just about taste, it's about principles. A fierce advocate for sustainable agriculture and natural living, Charles has long championed organic farming methods. His personal honey stash is an extension of that lifestyle, as well as a comforting constant amid the flux of royal life. Staff have been known to unpack jars of honey in luxury hotels, private residences, and even aboard royal trains, placing them within easy reach at breakfast or tea. To the untrained eye, it may seem eccentric, but for Charles, honey is both health tonic and ritual, drizzled carefully onto toast, cooled to his exact specifications. And while he carries honey in secrecy, his grandmother was hiding something far more indulgent in a place far more glittering. Queen Mary kept a secret stash of chocolate bars hidden in her jewelry case. Queen Mary of Teck, so often portrayed as regal and impenetrable, had a surprisingly sweet secretone that lay hidden not in the palace pantry, but in her jewelry case. Among the velvet-lined compartments meant for diamonds and tiaras, she reportedly kept a carefully concealed stash of chocolate bars. It was her personal indulgence, tucked away behind locked lids and beneath layers of silk and satin. The Queen Consort was known for her stern public image, seldom seen smiling in photographs and maintaining a strict regimen of royal decorum. But behind closed doors, she had a sweet tooth that rarely made its way into public view. The choice to hide chocolate in her jewelry case wasn't just for security, it was symbolic. In a life filled with public duty and private sacrifice, the chocolate represented a small rebellion, a delicious little secret against the weight of crown and expectation. Staff tasked with cleaning the case occasionally caught sight of the wrappers always neatly folded, as if even her guilty pleasures demanded etiquette. And while Mary stashed sweets beneath sapphires, her future granddaughter-in-law preferred mischief over indulgence, using her own voice to prank the very people she loved most. Princess Diana used to prank call her own sons, using silly voices. Behind the elegance, the heartbreak, and the flashbulbs, Princess Diana had a wicked sense of humor, especially when it came to her sons. One of her favorite pranks involved calling William and Harry on the palace landline while using exaggerated, silly voices. Sometimes she pretended to be a school teacher, other times a tabloid journalist, and occasionally a posh nanny with a nasal accent. The goal wasn't to fool them for long, it was to catch them off guard, make them laugh, and remind them that life behind palace walls could still be fun. The boys, once they caught on, would erupt into giggles, often trying to guess which persona she'd use next. It was part of Diana's unique parenting style, mixing royal formality with spontaneous joy, cutting through the stiffness of palace life with humor and warmth. Even palace staff got roped into the fun, some were asked to play along. Others were victims of her playful deception. These prank calls weren't just entertainment. They were acts of love, grounding her sons in laughter amid the intensity of royal life. And while Diana reached through telephone lines with laughter, her younger son once kept an entirely different companion under wraps a reptilian secret hidden in plain sight. Prince Harry had a pet turtle, which he kept hidden from palace staff. Among the polished halls and ancient tapestries of Kensington Palace, there once lived a quiet little secret. Not a scandal, not a dignitary, but a turtle. Prince Harry, long known for his rebellious streak, once kept a pet turtle in his private quarters, reportedly without formal permission or staff awareness. It wasn't an exotic breed or a gift from a diplomatist, a small, common turtle he had taken a liking to and decided to keep as a hidden companion. Nestled in a discreet terrarium tucked behind bookshelves or under a table, the turtle lived in peaceful obscurity. Harry fed it himself, cleaned its space, and occasionally brought it out to crawl across his floor during quieter hours. It wasn't the kind of animal you'd expect in royal company, and perhaps that was the point. For Harry, the turtle represented independence, privacy, and a whimsical rebellion against the endless structure of palace life. Eventually, staff discovered the pet, leading to some raised eyebrows, but by then, the turtle had already become part of Harry's story. And while he kept his reptilian friend under wraps, his grandmother enjoyed a different form of mimicry entirely, one that involved accents, impersonations, and performances no one outside her inner circle ever witnessed. Queen Elizabeth II enjoyed mimicking foreign accents, but only in private. To the world, Queen Elizabeth II was the voice of calm diplomacy, speaking with measured tones and unwavering precision, but behind palace walls, she was known to mimic people often with startling accuracy. Whether it was a visiting dignitary's clipped French English or a foreign ambassador's rolling R's, the Queen would delight in reproducing their speech patterns when only close family or trusted aides were present. It wasn't mockery, it was pure performance. Her impersonations were reportedly spot on and often hilarious, enhanced by subtle gestures or eyebrow lifts that betrayed her dry wit. Prince Harry once described her impressions as surprisingly cheeky, while palace staff viewed them as rare windows into her more playful side. These moments usually happened over tea, late in the evening, or during family holidays at Balmoral, where formalities relaxed and laughter flowed more freely. She never did it in public, never let the press see it, but those who witnessed it never forgot. It was a reminder that beneath the heavy crown and diplomatic distance lived a woman with remarkable observational skills and a perfectly tuned ear. And while she poked gentle fun with words, her grandfather found sharp amusement in another form entirely by keeping a royal burn book of insults. George V kept a personal diary of insults, where he rated his guests' manners. King George V, often remembered as stern and stoic, harbored a biting wit that rarely made it past his marble expression. But in private, he gave it full rein through a hidden diary in which he recorded his observations of guests, dignitaries, and even family members, rating their manners with scathing commentary. Tucked inside his desk drawer, this royal burn book included curt appraisals such as talks too much about himself, chewed with mouth a pen disgraceful, and so dull I nearly fell asleep. Some entries featured numerical scores, others bore underlined words like insufferable or tedious. George took this hobby seriously, treating it almost like a post-event report card. Staff were never to see it, and even close family only knew about it through whispered jokes and passing references. For a king bound by rigid formality in public, the diary served as a personal outlet, part comedy, part catharsis. It revealed not only his dry humor, but also his longing for honesty in a world governed by flattery and artifice. And while George scribbled complaints in secret, his grandmother before him hurled hers straight into public print through a pen name, a postbox, and a very Victorian sense of outrage. Queen Victoria wrote angry letters to newspapers using a pseudonym. Queen Victoria, so often imagined as the embodiment of Stoic monarchy, had a fiery side on that found expression in ink, under a false name, and through the post. Frustrated by how the press sometimes portrayed her, Victoria took it upon herself to respond directly but incognito. Using pseudonyms like a concerned observer or a loyal subject, she sent sharply worded letters to major newspapers complaining about mischaracterizations of the crown, gossip surrounding her family, or even editorials questioning British foreign policy. These weren't broad declarations of royal opinion. They were snippy, personal, and often dripping with indignation. She would meticulously craft her arguments, sometimes reviewing and rewriting them several times before dispatch. The editors, unaware of the sender's identity, occasionally printed them, unknowingly giving Britain's longest reigning monarch a secret column in their pages. Only a handful of close aides knew about this curious outlet, and they guarded the secret tightly. For Victoria, whose public image was increasingly shaped by caricature and rumor, it was a private way to fight back. Her legacy may be cast in marble, but in reality, she had more fire in her pen than most politicians. And while she wrote in secret, her descendant would travel with his ghosts framed, literal reminders of a lineage he could never escape. King Charles III brings framed photos of his ancestors to hotel rooms. For most travelers, a toothbrush, passport, and maybe a favorite book are enough. But for King Charles III, packing includes something far more unusual: framed photographs of his ancestors. Whenever he travels, whether for royal duty or private retreat, Charles reportedly insists that these photos be unpacked and placed around his temporary accommodations. The pictures include portraits of Queen Victoria, George VI, and other royal predecessors, all carefully chosen and housed in ornate frames. It's said that the arrangement is more than decorative, it's ceremonial. Each photograph must be positioned in a specific order and displayed in prominent places, turning even the most modern hotel suite into a mini shrine of monarchy. Palace aides tasked with setting up his rooms know the drill and treat it with reverence, ensuring the ancestors watch over the king during his stay. To Charles, it may be a grounding ritual, a reminder of his role within a centuries-long lineage. Others see it as theatrical or obsessive. But in his world, heritage is not just history, it's daily company. Yet even this habit of symbolic continuity pales in comparison to the combustive flair of his aunt, who once lit a room on fire just to make a point about temperature. Princess Margaret once set fire to her scarf to protest the room temperature. Princess Margaret, queen of the dramatic gesture, once made her opinion of a chilly drawing room unmistakably clear by setting her scarf ablaze. At a countryside estate she was visiting, the room was cold and the staff had been slow to adjust the heating. Rather than ask politely, Margaret pulled her silk scarf from around her shoulders, held it near the fireplace, and with a theatrical flourish, allowed it to catch flame. As it smoldered and curled, she reportedly declared, "Well, if no one else is going to warm the room, I suppose I shall." The stunned guests and staff rushed to extinguish the scarf before it caused more damage, but Margaret appeared entirely unbothered. For her, it wasn't an accident, it was performance. She had always wielded drama like a scepter, using her words, expressions, and actions to command attention. The scarf incident became legend among palace staff, another tale in the growing archive of her impossible-to-predict behavior. Yet it also reflected a deeper truth. Margaret despised discomfort and made no apologies for it. Her flair for the spectacular made her unforgettable. And while she burned silk in protest, her husband carried his own personal flame hidden in a flask shaped like something from under the sea. Prince Philip had a custom flask shaped like a submarine periscope. Never one to shy away from maritime nostalgia or a good drink, Prince Philip commissioned one of the oddest and most personal royal accessories ever crafted, a flask designed to look like a submarine periscope. A nod to his naval career and his notoriously quirky sense of humor, the flask was sleek, polished, and functional, doubling as both a discreet drinking vessel and a conversation piece. Shaped in cylindrical steel with subtle detailing, it could be unscrewed at the top to reveal a narrow opening, through which Philip would take a swig of whiskey or brandy during long hunting weekends or quiet retreats at Balmoral. Close friends often joked that he took a reading on the horizon before sipping, and Philip never denied Eth loved the absurdity. The flask was typically hidden in his coat pocket and only brought out among those who could appreciate the eccentricity without gasping at the breach of decorum. In a family where appearances mattered, Philip walked the line between discipline and mischief like a tightrope artist. While he drank like a naval officer, his wife continued to surprise in simpler ways, choosing Tupperware over silver when it came to her breakfast ritual. Queen Elizabeth II preferred cereal from plastic Tupperware, not the silver boxes. While the rest of Buckingham Palace gleamed with tradition and opulence, Queen Elizabeth II began her mornings with something that wouldn't have looked out of place in an ordinary British kitchen: Tupperware. In a curious break from the palace's polished routines, the Queen insisted that her breakfast cereal, typically Special K or Corn Flakes, be stored and served from humble plastic containers rather than the ornate silver canisters laid out for formal occasions. It wasn't a fluke, it was deliberate. The airtight seal, she believed, kept the cereal fresher, and she much preferred the crisp snap of Tupperware lids to the clumsy clang of silver tops. Her breakfast tray, otherwise adorned with linen napkins and fine bone china, would often include this quiet rebellion against royal pageantry. It was a small but telling quirk that hinted at her wartime upbringing and lifelong practicality. Visitors unfamiliar with the routine were often surprised to see the Queen scooping cereal with a silver spoon from a plastic tub. But to her, comfort and consistency mattered more than grandeur. And while she kept her mornings crisp and ordinary, Her father had a far more poetic take on dreary accessories going, so far as to rename the umbrella with a term only a king could invent. George VI called umbrellas miserable jellyfish. King George VI had a way with words, and sometimes that way veered into the wonderfully odd. Among his many private expressions, one particularly memorable nickname stood out. He called umbrellas miserable jellyfish. To him, the image was perfect. Umbrellas were floppy, moody, temperamental things collapsing at the slightest gust of wind and dripping with soggy disdain. George was never particularly fond of carrying one, even in London's famously damp weather. He found them clumsy, awkward, and in his own words, the most joyless of contraptions. On several occasions, aides tried to coax him into taking one to outdoor events, especially when rain threatened his formal attire. But he'd wave them off, muttering, "I'm not tangling with a jellyfish today." The nickname caught on with his close circle, and even palace staff began referring to umbrellas as jellyfish in quiet amusement. Despite his royal role, George VI held a common loathing for the same everyday nuisances that frustrated millions of Britons. Yet while he saw inanimate objects as foes, his grandson Prince William preferred to confront life's absurdities head-on, even rehearsing jokes in the mirror like a stand-up comedian preparing for court. Prince William practices dad jokes in front of the mirror, according to Kate. Behind the polished public image of Prince William, the poised, dutiful future king lurks a man with a deep commitment to one of fatherhood's most time-honored traditions, the dad joke. According to Catherine, Princess of Wales, William doesn't just deliver them off the cuff. He rehearses them in front of the mirror. Apparently, before school runs or public appearances where he might want to lighten the mood, William is known to test out groan-worthy punchlines on himself, gauging delivery and timing like a stand-up comic. What do you call a royal with a cheesy joke? William, he's reportedly quipped. Though his attempts are often met with eye rolls from his children and the occasional affectionate sigh from Katihi remains undeterred. Staff have noted that his sense of humor, equal parts earnest and awkward, is one of his most relatable traits. He enjoys making others laugh, even if it's at his own expense. For William, these jokes are more than comedy, they're connection, a way to bridge the distance between crown and commoner, and between father and child. And while he refines his punchlines, his grandmother once took that sense of mischief further outrunning her own security just to remind them who was really in charge. Queen Elizabeth II once outdrove her security team, on purpose. Though she spent most of her life behind tinted windows and in the backseat of armored cars, Queen Elizabeth II never forgot how to handle a steering wheel, and she took pleasure in reminding others of it. Trained as a driver and mechanic during World War II, she retained her confidence behind the wheel well into her later years. One day, while at her Windsor estate, she decided to take her Range Rover out for a spin, dressed incognito in a scarf and sunglasses. Her security detail, expecting a leisurely cruise, trailed behind in a separate vehicle. But the Queen had other plans. Picking up speed, she maneuvered the winding estate roads with unexpected agility, putting enough distance between her and the trailing team that they reportedly lost visual contact for several minutes. When they finally caught up to her at a turnoff near the stables, she was calmly parked, waiting with a wry smile. "Took you long enough," she's said to have quipped. It wasn't just about thrill, it was a rare moment of freedom in a life dictated by routine. And as she proved she could still set the pace, her son Charles was packing another surprise for his travel's own gallery of royal masterpieces. King Charles III takes his own artwork on holidays and hangs them in hotel rooms. For King Charles III, travel isn't just about comfort, it's about atmosphere. and nothing sets the tone quite like his own art. When embarking on extended trips, Charles reportedly brings several of his watercolor paintings with him, personally selecting each one to suit the mood of his temporary residence. Whether he's staying in a countryside lodge, a royal guest house, or a luxury hotel, staff are instructed to hang the paintings in specific places before his arrival. The subject matter often includes misty landscapes, Scottish hills, and countryside vista-scomming images that offer him a sense of familiarity and grounding. To outsiders, it might seem excessive or even vain, but for Charles, these artworks are deeply personal. They're not decorations, they're expressions of peace, creativity, and memory. In rooms otherwise filled with impersonal hotel art or stark white walls, his paintings transform the space into something warmer, more human. The practice underscores his belief that beauty and tranquility can and should follow you wherever you go. And while his art travels by frame, his father once chose to test his endurance in a face-off with nature itself by locking eyes with one of the animal kingdom's most unamused observers. Prince Philip once challenged a zookeeper to a staring contest with a gorilla. Leave it to Prince Philip to turn a routine royal visit into a moment of surreal comedy. During a tour of a wildlife conservation center, Philip and the Queen were shown to the gorilla enclosure, where one particularly large silverback was lounging near the viewing glass. As the Queen observed quietly, Philip, with a mischievous twinkle in his eye, leaned toward the glass and locked eyes with the gorilla. The zookeeper chuckled nervously and commented that the animal was known for being particularly territorial. That was all the encouragement Philip needed. He declared, "Right, I'll take him on then," and began a staring contest that drew both laughter and horror from onlookers. For nearly a full minute, Philip and the gorilla held each other's gaze, unblinking, until the gorilla, perhaps confused or unimpressed, finally turned away. Triumphantly, Philip turned back to the zookeeper and said, "I win. Tell him that." Whether it was bravado, boredom, or his lifelong love of provoking reactions, the moment captured everything that made Philip such a unique royal force. And while he sparred with gorillas, his wife was finding delight in something much less wild but no less ritualistic or very peculiar name for dinner. Queen Elizabeth II referred to big state dinners as the Royal Munch. In the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, state dinners are massive affairs. Gilt-edged menus, polished silver, courses choreographed down to the second. But to Queen Elizabeth II, these diplomatic feasts had a simpler and far cheekier nickname, the Royal Munch. The term, which she used privately among family and staff, was part of her dry, understated humor. When asked how her evening looked, she'd sometimes reply, "Oh, just another Royal Munch," as if she were attending a casual buffet instead of hosting heads of state. The phrase became a quiet joke among those in her inner circle, often whispered in the hours before major events. Staff would scurry around preparing for visits from presidents and prime ministers while muttering, "Munch time again." For the Queen, it was a way to deflate the pomp just enough to keep her sane. Her ability to find humor in protocol was one of her most underappreciated traits. Beneath the formalities, the Queen was fully aware of the theatricality of monarchy, and she often chose to play her part with a wink. Thus, with one final inside joke, she closed a chapter not only on lavish banquets, but on an entire lineage of eccentric, enduring royal oddities.